Imagine a scenario in which a person sits in a sealed room with a quantum device that will either kill them or leave them unharmed based on the random decay of a radioactive atom, much like the famous thought experiment known as Schrödinger's cat, except the outcome determines whether they live or die. According to quantum mechanics, at the moment of measurement, the universe splits into multiple branches where both outcomes occur simultaneously, one branch where the person dies and another where they survive. Quantum immortality proposes that from the perspective of the conscious observer, they will always find themselves in the branch where they survive, because dead observers cannot experience anything at all. This means that no matter how many times a person subjects themselves to lethal quantum scenarios, their subjective experience will always continue forward in the reality where they happen to survive, making them effectively immortal from their own point of view. The logical mechanism here relies on a crucial distinction between objective probability and subjective experience. While an outside observer watching multiple instances of these experiments would see a 50% death rate and understand that most versions of the subject would die, the subject themselves would never experience their own death because consciousness cannot exist in a deceased state. Each time they face a lethal quantum event, their conscious experience necessarily continues in whichever branch contains their survival, however improbable that branch might be. Over time, this creates an increasingly strange and increasingly isolated reality for the subject, as they find themselves surviving scenario after scenario that should have killed them, living in ever more improbable branches of reality where unlikely events keep unfolding in their favor. In the vast expanse of theoretical physics and cosmology, there exists a peculiar thought experiment that challenges our fundamental understanding of consciousness, existence, and what might persist after death, known as the Boltzmann brain hypothesis. This concept emerges from the work of 19th-century Austrian physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, who explored the nature of entropy and the statistical likelihood of various states occurring within the universe over infinite time scales. The theory suggests that given enough time, purely by random chance and the random fluctuations of particles in an infinite universe, a conscious brain could spontaneously assemble itself from the void, complete with all its neural structures, memories, and subjective experiences fully formed. This brain would simply materialize from chaos, exist for a brief moment of consciousness, and then dissolve back into disorder, all without any evolutionary process or biological development to precede it. The mechanism underlying this theory rests on the principle that in an infinitely old universe approaching maximum entropy, every possible configuration of matter and energy becomes statistically inevitable given sufficient time, no matter how monumentally improbable any single configuration might seem. If consciousness is purely a product of physical matter arranged in particular ways, then consciousness itself becomes just another possible configuration that the universe might randomly produce. This raises an extraordinary question about the afterlife and identity, because if a Boltzmann brain could arise spontaneously after the death of a biological organism, then perhaps consciousness might emerge again through pure statistical accident, creating a kind of random resurrection divorced from any causal chain or personal continuity. Consider the possibility that death is not an ending, but rather a system malfunction that triggers a complete reset of the simulation in which we exist, much like a video game returning to its main menu or loading screen when the player character reaches an unrecoverable state. According to this theory, the universe we perceive through our senses is actually an extraordinarily complex computational program running on some form of advanced infrastructure beyond our comprehension, and our consciousness serves as the player navigating through this digital construct. When a human being dies, the theory suggests, the system recognizes that this particular instance of consciousness has reached its programmed endpoint, and rather than allowing the awareness to simply cease or transition elsewhere, the entire simulation pauses and initiates a complete reset protocol. This reset would theoretically wipe the deceased individual's memories, personality traits, and accumulated experiences, preparing the consciousness to be redistributed into a new instance within the simulation, perhaps born into a different family, culture, or era entirely. The mechanism behind this concept draws from our modern understanding of how software systems handle errors and resource management, transposing these computational principles onto the fundamental nature of reality itself. We have become so accustomed to restarting computers, refreshing web browsers, and resetting devices when they malfunction that we unconsciously project these technological processes onto metaphysical questions, finding strange comfort in the idea that even death might simply be a technical reboot rather than true cessation. The theory persists partly because it borrows the language and logic of contemporary technology, making it feel plausible to minds shaped by digital existence. Yet it ultimately remains speculative and entirely unfalsifiable, resting on the assumption that consciousness can be erased and redistributed without loss or fundamental change to its essential nature. Imagine a future where the precise patterns of your thoughts, memories, and personality could be scanned, mapped, and transferred into a digital substrate, creating a perfect copy of your mind that continues to exist within a computer system or distributed network long after your biological body has ceased to function. This is the theory of consciousness uploading, a concept that has captured the imagination of transhumanists, technologists, and philosophers who believe that death might not be the end if we can simply preserve the information patterns that make us who we are. The underlying mechanism assumes that consciousness is fundamentally computational in nature, that the essential ingredient of your selfhood is not tied to your specific atoms or neurons, but rather to the arrangement and connections between them, the algorithms running through your brain that produce your thoughts and experiences. If this is true, then theoretically, if we could map every synapse, every neurotransmitter interaction, every electrical impulse in the human brain at sufficient resolution, we could replicate that system in silicon and achieve a form of digital immortality. The appeal of this theory lies in its elegant resolution to mortality, suggesting that technological advancement could eventually render death optional, that consciousness might persist indefinitely in virtual environments or robotic bodies, free from biological decay. Yet despite the sophisticated arguments from respected neuroscientists and AI researchers who lend credibility to this framework, consciousness uploading persists in popular culture and transhumanist circles as a kind of modern secular salvation, a technologically flavored answer to ancient human anxieties about non-existence. We have become comfortable entertaining this possibility without resolving fundamental questions about personal identity, the explanatory gap between information processing and subjective experience, or whether a digital copy would truly be you or merely an imposter wearing your memories like a suit, leaving the original consciousness to face oblivion while its twin awakens elsewhere. Imagine that death does not represent an ending at all, but rather a cosmic reset button that sends your consciousness back through time to relive your entire existence exactly as it was, moment by moment, choice by choice, forever and ever without variation or mercy. This is the theory of eternal recurrence, a concept that suggests the universe operates in infinite cycles, and every life that has ever been lived will be lived again an infinite number of times, with no memory of previous iterations and no possibility of changing anything because the fundamental laws of physics dictate that everything must unfold identically. The mechanism behind this unsettling notion rests on the idea that the universe contains a finite amount of matter and energy distributed across infinite time. And if you accept that proposition, then logically, there are only so many possible configurations those particles can arrange themselves into before they must begin repeating the exact same patterns they have already formed countless times before. When you die in this framework, you do not ascend to heaven or descend to hell or dissolve into nothingness. Instead, the atoms that comprise your body and consciousness scatter and eventually reconvene in the exact same arrangement they occupied billions of years ago, forcing you to experience your entire life again with the same thoughts, the same conversations, the same mistakes, and the same moments of joy, all playing out in identical sequence like a record stuck in an endless loop. What makes this theory persist in human consciousness, despite its philosophically troubling implications, is that it presents a strange form of comfort to some people, a way of accepting death that neither requires belief in supernatural judgment nor demands acceptance of true oblivion, offering instead a kind of immortality through repetition that makes every moment matter infinitely because you will experience it infinite times. In Tibetan Buddhism, there exists a concept known as the Bardo state, which describes an intermediate realm or transitional period that the consciousness experiences between death and rebirth, a liminal space that stretches across days or even weeks where the deceased soul remains suspended between its former life and its next incarnation, neither fully departed nor yet reborn into a new body. According to this ancient tradition, the Bardo is not a single unified experience, but rather a series of distinct phases, beginning immediately after death when consciousness separates from the physical form and enters what practitioners call the clear light of death, an extraordinary moment of perfect awareness where the true nature of mind is said to be revealed in its purest form. Followed by the emergence of peaceful and wrathful deities that represent different aspects of consciousness and psychological reality, manifested through increasingly vivid hallucinations and visions that the consciousness interprets based on its karma and mental conditioning accumulated throughout the life that has just ended. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief stems from humanity's fundamental difficulty in comprehending absolute non-existence and our need to construct narratives of continuity and meaning even in the face of death itself, allowing us to imagine that consciousness persists in some form and that the transition between life and death involves gradual processes rather than instantaneous cessation, which provides psychological comfort and suggests that our awareness might somehow endure the ultimate rupture that death represents. Open individualism is a metaphysical philosophy suggesting that at death, your individual consciousness does not end, but rather dissolves back into a universal field of awareness, and that this same universal consciousness animates all sentient beings throughout time and space, meaning that fundamentally there is only one consciousness experiencing itself through infinite perspectives simultaneously. The theory proposes that what we perceive as separate minds, distinct individuals walking around with their own private thoughts and subjective experiences, are actually localized expressions of a singular underlying awareness that permeates reality itself, comparable to how individual waves in an ocean appear separate from one another yet remain part of the same body of water. When you die, according to this philosophy, your personal identity dissolves like salt returning to the sea, and your consciousness merges back into this universal mind, though the dissolution is not experienced as loss because consciousness itself persists, merely without the bounded perspective that made you feel like an individual self. The mechanism underlying this belief rests on the observation that consciousness seems fundamentally mysterious and difficult to explain through physical means alone, leading some thinkers to conclude that perhaps the universe is inherently conscious, and that what we call individual minds are simply temporary perspectives generated by a deeper unified field of awareness experiencing itself from countless vantage points. It persists as a philosophy despite lacking empirical validation because it addresses the deep anxiety about personal extinction while simultaneously offering a kind of radical equality and interconnection between all beings, suggesting that we are literally each other experiencing different moments and perspectives, which creates a psychologically comforting vision where death is not obliteration, but merely a return to our true nature as part of something infinite and eternal that has always been conscious and will always remain so. Consider the modern person who spends their final years cultivating an identity so distinctive, so meticulously personalized, that it becomes the central organizing principle of their existence, only to contemplate what happens when that identity simply ceases. Empty individualism proposes that after death, the elaborate and carefully constructed sense of individual selfhood that we've spent a lifetime building and defending dissolves into absolute nothingness, leaving behind no trace of the particular flavor that made us uniquely ourselves. This theory emerges from observing how thoroughly we've become invested in the idea that our personality, our preferences, our curated sense of self, and our individual perspective matter cosmically, that somehow the universe has taken note of our specific combination of quirks and tastes and accumulated experience. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory involves recognizing that we invest tremendous emotional energy into distinguishing ourselves from others, into developing opinions that feel authentically ours, into collecting possessions and experiences that reflect our singular aesthetic sensibilities, all while harboring a quiet terror that this entire elaborate construction might amount to nothing once the biological machine that generates consciousness ceases functioning. What makes empty individualism particularly unsettling is how it inverts the modern promise of self-actualization and personal authenticity, suggesting instead that the more completely we develop and express our individual nature, the more we have to lose in death, with nothing to show for that effort except memories in other people's minds that will themselves eventually vanish. Closed individualism represents a deeply unsettling philosophical position that suggests your consciousness is fundamentally isolated and unrepeatable, meaning that when you die, the universe as you experience it ceases to exist entirely, at least from your subjective perspective, and no version of you will ever exist again in any form whatsoever. Imagine standing alone in a room with the understanding that everyone else in that room is equally alone in their own separate rooms, their own separate universes of experience, completely sealed off from yours in ways that can never be bridged or understood, and that when the door to your room closes for the final time, it locks permanently behind you with no possibility of ever opening it again. The mechanism behind closed individualism rests on a particular interpretation of consciousness and identity that suggests each person's subjective experience is so utterly unique and particular that it cannot be replicated, transferred, or continued in any meaningful way after death, because consciousness itself is treated as an inherent property of a singular body and brain that ceases when that body ceases to function. This creates a kind of philosophical isolation that extends beyond mere loneliness into something more fundamental about the nature of existence itself, where your perspective on reality is treated as a sealed universe unto itself, with no real exit or continuation possible. What makes this theory persist despite its bleak implications is that it aligns with our immediate intuitive understanding of how consciousness feels from the inside, which is genuinely solitary and private, and we have normalized this particular framing of consciousness so thoroughly through our language and culture that alternative perspectives often feel intellectually dishonest or evasive. Even though closed individualism represents only one possible interpretation of consciousness, rather than an established scientific fact about the nature of existence and identity after death. Imagine that the moment you die, your consciousness doesn't simply vanish into nothingness, but rather becomes integrated into the fundamental fabric of reality itself, woven into the biological processes that continue throughout the universe long after your individual body has ceased to function. This is the essence of biocentrism, a perspective that suggests consciousness isn't merely a byproduct of brain activity, but rather the primary force that creates and sustains reality, and that when we die, our awareness merges back into this universal biological consciousness that has existed since the beginning of time. The theory proposes that death represents not an ending but a transformation, where the individual stream of consciousness that felt so distinctly you during your lifetime becomes part of an infinite, interconnected web of living processes that span across galaxies and dimensions we cannot yet perceive. What makes this theory psychologically compelling is that it addresses one of our deepest anxieties about mortality by suggesting that the essential part of us, our awareness itself, cannot truly be destroyed because it was never separate from the universe in the first place. We find ourselves drawn to biocentrism because it reconciles the apparent permanence of the physical world with the undeniable reality of subjective experience, offering a middle ground between materialism and pure spiritualism that feels both scientifically grounded and spiritually comforting. The theory persists in contemporary thought despite having no empirical evidence supporting it, largely because it satisfies our intuitive sense that consciousness feels too real, too vivid, too fundamental to simply cease existing, and we have quietly normalized this idea by discussing it in quasi-scientific language that gives it the appearance of legitimacy while remaining fundamentally untestable and rooted in metaphysical rather than measurable principles. Robert Lanza, a prominent biologist and regenerative medicine researcher, has proposed a controversial framework he calls biocentrism, which suggests that consciousness is fundamental to the universe rather than merely a byproduct of it, and that death, as we understand it, may be fundamentally misunderstood by the limitations of our perception. According to Lanza's theory, the universe does not exist independent of observation, meaning that consciousness plays an active role in shaping reality itself. And if this premise is true, then the end of individual consciousness might not represent an absolute termination, but rather a transition or transformation within the fabric of existence. Lanza argues that because quantum physics demonstrates that particles exist in superposition until observed, consciousness cannot be separated from the creation of reality, and therefore our assumption that death ends our existence is based on a false understanding of what consciousness actually is. He proposes that when the body dies, consciousness does not simply vanish into nothingness, but rather transitions into other branches of the universe or multiple realities, where versions of ourselves continue to exist in different dimensional states that we cannot perceive from our current biological limitations. This theory draws heavily from interpretations of quantum mechanics and the many worlds hypothesis, suggesting that every possible outcome of every quantum event actually occurs in some version of reality, and that consciousness somehow navigates through these multiverses. The appeal of biocentrism lies in its attempt to bridge the gaps between quantum physics and consciousness studies, offering a framework that takes seriously both scientific observation and the subjective nature of awareness. Imagine a scenario where you sit before a machine that, according to the laws of quantum mechanics, has a 50% chance of killing you instantly and painlessly, and a 50% chance of doing nothing at all. You activate the machine, and from the perspective of any outside observer, there is a 50% probability that you have just died. However, from your own subjective experience, you find yourself alive, having somehow survived the deadly outcome. You activate it again, and again you survive, and again. The odds of surviving 10 consecutive 50-50 death scenarios would be 1 in 1,000, yet here you are, conscious and aware, having somehow navigated through all of them. This is the fundamental premise of quantum suicide, a philosophical thought experiment that emerges from the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, a framework suggesting that every quantum event spawns multiple branching realities where each possible outcome actually occurs. The mechanism underlying this theory operates on the idea that your consciousness can only ever experience the branches of reality in which you continue to exist, creating a selection bias where death becomes theoretically impossible from your first-person perspective, no matter how improbable survival becomes. What makes quantum suicide so persistently fascinating is how it operates at the intersection of physics, philosophy, and existential anxiety, offering a darkly comforting notion that consciousness might be fundamentally protected by the structure of reality itself. Despite having no empirical evidence whatsoever and remaining deeply controversial even among physicists and philosophers, the theory continues to captivate minds precisely because it addresses our deepest fear of non-existence by suggesting that perhaps, from some quantum level, we might be incapable of ever truly ceasing to be, even as the external world moves on without us, unaware of our strange immortality in increasingly unlikely branches of reality. Imagine that consciousness itself is not some ethereal substance or spiritual essence, but rather information encoded in a vast computational system, and that when we die, our minds do not dissolve into nothingness, but instead transfer into a different layer of this universal code, where existence continues as a form of digital persistence stored within the fabric of reality itself. This theory suggests that the universe operates fundamentally as a mathematical structure or information system, and that what we experience as physical reality is merely one expression of this underlying computational substrate, while the afterlife would represent another expression entirely, perhaps one governed by different rules of logic and different parameters of existence. Proponents of this view point to the seemingly mathematical nature of physics, the strange parallels between quantum mechanics and information theory, and the way consciousness appears mysteriously intertwined with observation and information processing, suggesting that at the deepest level, reality might be code rather than matter or energy. The psychological appeal lies in its attempt to reconcile spirituality with scientific thinking, offering a framework where the soul becomes data, heaven becomes a server, and eternity becomes an infinitely complex algorithm running in perpetuity. It allows believers to maintain faith in an afterlife while speaking in the language of technology and mathematics, granting spiritual beliefs a veneer of scientific credibility that feels contemporary and intellectually sophisticated rather than antiquated or superstitious. This theory persists despite lacking any testable mechanism or empirical evidence, sustained by our growing dependence on digital metaphors to understand consciousness, our increasing anxiety about artificial intelligence and data permanence, and our deep cultural desire to believe that nothing we are is ever truly lost. That information once created cannot be annihilated, but only transformed into states we have not yet learned to perceive. Consider the peculiar theory that death is not an endpoint, but rather a cyclical return, where consciousness becomes trapped in an endless loop of reincarnation, doomed to repeat the same lives, the same choices, the same outcomes across infinite iterations without ever progressing or escaping toward any ultimate destination or enlightenment. In this conception, you might be reborn as the same person in the same circumstances, making identical decisions at identical moments, living through identical relationships and traumas and joys, only to die and begin again in precisely the same configuration, as though existence itself has become a broken record, playing the same song endlessly through eternity. The appeal of this idea rests partly on observations we make in our waking lives, where people do seem to repeat patterns compulsively, where family dysfunction echoes across generations, where individuals find themselves making the same mistakes with different partners or in different contexts, suggesting some deeper gravitational force pulling them toward familiar suffering. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory involves the human tendency to seek patterns and meaning in chaos, to recognize cycles as proof of something deeper at work rather than the simple operation of habit, learned behavior, and the limited repertoire of choices available within constrained circumstances. We notice that people repeat their parents' mistakes, that history seems to rhyme, that certain personality types seem drawn to certain outcomes, and from these observations we extrapolate backward and forward, imagining that this cyclical nature must continue beyond death, that the soul or consciousness cannot break free from its ingrained patterns and therefore must eternally reenact them. Imagine a moment at the bedside of a dying loved one, where their breathing becomes shallow and irregular, their eyes flutter closed for the final time, and in that precise instant, something seems to leave the room entirely, as though an invisible passenger has stepped off a departing vessel, and you find yourself wondering if perhaps their consciousness has transferred into someone else, perhaps a newborn child born at that exact moment somewhere across the world. Or maybe into an animal that crosses your path shortly thereafter, or possibly into another person who suddenly experiences a profound personality shift or begins remembering things they should have no way of knowing. This theory suggests that souls do not simply cease to exist or float away into an abstract afterlife, but rather move laterally through the fabric of existence, swapping bodies and identities like passengers changing trains at a crowded station, so that the moment your grandmother passes away, a distant infant opens its eyes for the first time and begins crying with a voice that somehow sounds eerily familiar to you. As though she has simply relocated to a new address and begun a new chapter under different circumstances. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief likely stems from our profound discomfort with genuine cessation, with the absolute finality of death, and our desperate need to believe that what we love simply transforms rather than terminates, that consciousness persists not in heavenly realms but in the continuity of life itself, moving from one vessel to another like water poured between containers, never truly lost but merely redistributed. We see correlations in sudden personality changes in comatose patients who wake up, or in the eerie sense that newborns sometimes possess an ancient quality, a knowingness that seems too profound for such tiny, undeveloped beings, and we weave these observations into a narrative that feels both comforting and explanatory. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, known in its original language as the Bardo Thodol, presents an extraordinarily detailed map of what occurs in the intermediate state between death and rebirth, a realm called the Bardo that is said to last anywhere from 3 to 49 days, depending on the individual's karma and spiritual development. According to this ancient Buddhist text, the consciousness of the deceased person does not simply vanish at the moment of physical death, but instead enters a peculiar twilight dimension where it encounters increasingly intense visions, judgments, and opportunities for liberation, progressing through several distinct stages that become progressively more chaotic and overwhelming. The first bardo, known as the Chikai Bardo, occurs at the precise moment of death when the consciousness is believed to experience the clear light of ultimate reality, a transcendent luminosity that represents the most profound opportunity for enlightenment, yet one that most people fail to recognize due to their spiritual ignorance and lifelong conditioning. Those who do not achieve liberation during this initial moment then enter the Chaniad Bardo, where peaceful and wrathful deities begin to manifest in increasingly graphic and terrifying forms, each representing different aspects of the psyche and different karmic forces, with these visions becoming progressively more disturbing and overwhelming as the consciousness becomes more confused and desperate. The psychological mechanism underlying this elaborate conception seems rooted in the human tendency to project internal psychological states outward, and to interpret them as external, objective realities, combined with the natural human impulse to find meaning and structure in experiences that are fundamentally unknowable, creating a detailed narrative that transforms the terror of unconsciousness into a comprehensible spiritual journey. According to this particular theory of the afterlife, when a person dies, their soul embarks upon an extraordinarily perilous journey through the Duat, which is the ancient Egyptian underworld, a vast and shadowy realm filled with countless obstacles, hostile demons, and treacherous passages that must be navigated with precise knowledge and unwavering spiritual fortitude in order to reach the Hall of Judgment where Osiris himself presides over the weighing of the heart. The theory suggests that the deceased must memorize specific incantations and spells found within the Book of the Dead, a collection of magical texts that served as an ancient spiritual guidebook, and recite these words at precisely the right moments to pass through each barrier and appease the terrifying guardians who stand watch at the gates. Creatures with names like the Devourer of the Dead, and beings with serpent bodies and animal heads who will consume the unworthy soul if it cannot demonstrate sufficient knowledge and purity. What makes this theory particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is how it reflects humanity's deep need to impose order and structure upon the chaos of death, transforming the unknowable into something that feels manageable through preparation, study, and adherence to prescribed rituals, as if death itself could be studied and mastered like any other academic subject. The Egyptians essentially created an elaborate map of the afterlife, turning death from a sudden void into a challenging journey with defined stages and outcomes, which likely provided tremendous psychological comfort to people facing their mortality. Remarkably, elements of this theory still persist in various modern spiritual and religious frameworks around the world, where the concept of the soul's journey continues to captivate human imagination, and countless contemporary people still believe in an afterlife requiring specific knowledge or moral preparation, suggesting that the fundamental human impulse to systematize and understand death through narrative frameworks remains as powerful today as it was in ancient times. In ancient Egyptian belief systems, one of the most elaborate and visually documented theories about the afterlife involved a procedure known as the weighing of the heart, a ceremony that determined whether a deceased person's soul would be granted access to paradise or condemned to oblivion. According to texts inscribed within burial chambers and on papyri, when an individual died, their heart would be removed from their body and placed upon one side of a massive cosmic scale, while a single feather representing truth, justice, or the concept of Mot would be positioned on the other side. And if the heart proved heavier than the feather due to the accumulated weight of sins and moral transgressions, the scales would tip downward, and the heart would be devoured by a creature called Ammit, a hybrid beast with the head of a crocodile, the torso of a lion, and the rear of a hippopotamus, resulting in complete annihilation of the soul and eternal non-existence. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory reveals a sophisticated understanding of human guilt and accountability, as the ancient Egyptians essentially encoded their moral anxieties into a concrete and visual system where ethical weight could be literally measured, suggesting that conscience itself has substance and consequence, and that the universe maintains an inherent balance in which wrongdoing creates a burden that eventually becomes too heavy to carry. In Tibetan Buddhism, particularly within the traditions of the Bardo Thodol, or what is commonly known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there exists an extraordinarily specific doctrine describing a 49-day intermediate state that follows physical death and precedes rebirth. According to this ancient framework, the consciousness of a deceased person does not immediately transition into a new life, but instead enters a liminal period of exactly 7 weeks' duration, during which the being experiences a series of profound visions, judgments, and opportunities for spiritual advancement or descent. During these 49 days, the deceased person's consciousness supposedly encounters increasingly intense manifestations, beginning with peaceful deities and progressing toward wrathful ones, each day presenting new possibilities for liberation through recognition of these visions as projections of the mind rather than external realities. The specific number 49 holds particular significance because it divides evenly into 7 weeks of 7 days, each corresponding to different stages of consciousness and different spiritual opportunities. What makes this belief system especially striking is the precision with which it delineates this intermediate realm, complete with detailed descriptions of subtle body experiences, the appearance of deceased relatives, and the gradual dimming of one's karmic vision. The psychological underpinning of this doctrine appears rooted in several human needs: the desire to provide structure and meaning to the incomprehensible void of death, the need to believe that consciousness continues in some form even after bodily cessation, and the comfort found in imagining that the process of dying and transitioning is not instantaneous, but rather a prolonged journey during which one might still influence their ultimate destination through mental discipline and awareness. In the traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, particularly within the schools that practice reincarnation theology, there exists an elaborate system for identifying which child represents the rebirth of a recently deceased lama or spiritual teacher, and these identifying markers are known as rebirth signs, a practice that has persisted for centuries throughout the Himalayan regions and continues to influence succession decisions in monasteries to this day. When a high lama dies, the community does not simply accept that this individual has departed permanently, but rather they enter into a period of careful observation and investigation, looking for newborns born around the time of death or shortly thereafter who display specific physical markings, behavioral characteristics, or abilities that would indicate they are the reincarnated soul of the deceased master. And these signs can include unusual birthmarks that match wounds or scars the lama possessed, an inexplicable ability to recognize personal objects belonging to the deceased, or a demonstrated knowledge of rituals and teachings they could not possibly have learned through conventional means. The psychological mechanism underlying this practice operates through a combination of pattern recognition, grief processing, and the human tendency to find confirmation of our deepest beliefs when we actively search for them. As bereaved communities experiencing the loss of revered spiritual figures channel their longing for continuity into systematic observation of infants, essentially constructing elaborate narratives around coincidences and childhood behaviors that might occur naturally in any developing child, but gain profound significance within this interpretive framework. Imagine a cosmic library existing beyond physical space and time, a universal repository of all knowledge, all events, and all experiences that have ever occurred since the beginning of existence itself. According to this theory, when you die, your consciousness gains access to the akashic records, which proponents describe as a fundamental field of information that permeates all of reality, containing every thought ever thought, every action ever taken, and every consequence that has ever rippled through the universe. The concept originates from Sanskrit philosophy and theosophy, suggesting that these records exist in a non-physical dimension that can only be accessed through spiritual elevation or after death, when the constraints of the material body no longer bind the soul. Those who believe in this theory propose that upon death, the individual consciousness expands and merges with this universal database, allowing departed souls to perceive the complete interconnected history of all creation, to understand their own past lives, to see the causal chains that led to their existence, and to comprehend their purpose within the larger cosmic narrative. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our profound discomfort with the finality of death and our deep human need to believe that nothing is ever truly lost, that information persists somewhere somehow, and that our individual lives matter within an incomprehensibly vast universe. We find comfort in imagining that a record of our existence is preserved eternally, that future beings or higher intelligences could theoretically access knowledge of us, and that our consciousness might somehow transcend its temporary biological container to become part of something greater and eternal. Consider the experience of those who report leaving their bodies during moments of profound stress, illness, or meditation, floating weightlessly above the physical form and observing the world from a perspective that seems impossible, yet feels utterly real in the moment of occurrence. These individuals describe moving through walls, traveling vast distances instantaneously, encountering other consciousness entities, and exploring realms of breathtaking beauty or terrifying darkness, all while maintaining a sense of awareness and intention that feels more lucid than ordinary waking consciousness. The astral plane, as believers describe it, is a non-physical dimension that exists alongside our material reality, a realm where consciousness can manifest in forms unconstrained by bodily limitations, where thought becomes action and intention shapes reality according to principles fundamentally different from those governing the physical world. The psychological mechanism underlying these experiences involves the brain's remarkable capacity for out-of-body sensations, particularly during states of extreme stress, sleep paralysis, or deep meditative states where the boundary between the waking and sleeping mind becomes permeable and unstable. When sensory input becomes disrupted, or when the brain's proprioceptive systems malfunction, the mind generates a compelling sense of spatial displacement, essentially creating an elaborate hallucination that feels absolutely convincing, because it engages the same neural pathways that process genuine perception and memory. What persists most remarkably is how these accounts remain consistent across centuries and cultures, with explorers from ancient Tibetan monasteries to modern spiritualists describing strikingly similar features and structures in these supposed non-physical realms, suggesting either a genuine shared dimension or an equally fascinating universal pattern of human consciousness that generates identical hallucinations regardless of background or expectation. Imagine the moment of death not as a gentle transition or a complete dissolution, but rather as a catastrophic fracturing event in which the unified consciousness that defines a person splinters into countless irretrievable fragments, each piece scattering across different dimensions or planes of existence in a chaotic and permanent separation. According to this theory, the soul does not remain intact as it departs the body, but instead experiences something akin to psychological glass breaking under extreme pressure, with each fragment containing partial memories, emotions, and aspects of identity that become isolated from one another forever. Some proponents of this idea suggest that these shattered pieces might drift into various afterlife realms or spiritual dimensions, unable to recognize or communicate with their other fragments, essentially trapping different versions of the same person in isolated experiential prisons. The mechanism behind this concept draws heavily from quantum physics misinterpretations and trauma psychology, suggesting that the extreme shock of consciousness separating from the physical body creates an unprecedented force that the unified soul simply cannot withstand. Individuals who experience severe trauma or existential crisis in life supposedly show signs of this fragmenting process even before death, with their consciousness developing cracks and fissures that only worsen as the moment of passing approaches. What makes this theory persist despite its lack of any testable framework is perhaps our deep cultural comfort with fragmentation metaphors themselves, the way we describe shattered identities and broken spirits in ordinary conversation, normalizing the idea that something precious can be irreparably broken rather than simply transformed or ended, allowing this melancholic vision to feel somehow intuitive even in the absence of any logical mechanism that could sustain it. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of how memories fade from the minds of the living after someone dies, a process so thorough and inevitable that it borders on the metaphysical. Within a generation or two, the specific details of a person's life, their mannerisms, their favorite meals, the exact cadence of their laughter, the particular way they held their hands when they spoke, begin to dissolve into abstraction, leaving behind only vague impressions and fragmented stories told at family gatherings. The theory of the void of forgetting suggests that death itself might not be an ending at all, but rather a transition into a state of increasing erasure, where the deceased gradually fades from existence not through any supernatural mechanism, but through the simple human limitation of memory and attention. As the people who knew them personally pass away in turn, fewer and fewer minds contain the actual experience of who that person was, until eventually all direct knowledge of their existence vanishes entirely, replaced by genealogical records and photographs that bear little resemblance to the living, breathing human they once were. The mechanism behind this theory rests on a fundamental observation about consciousness itself, that all experience exists only in the minds that perceive it, and when those minds cease to exist, the experience ceases to have any tangible reality, becoming retroactively less real with each passing year and forgotten witness. We have normalized this erasure so completely that we barely notice it happening, treating it as natural and inevitable rather than as a kind of ongoing death, a second death that occurs slowly across generations, removing a person from the present world far more thoroughly than their physical body ever left it. In ancient Greek mythology, the river of Lethe flows through the underworld as one of several mythological waterways that separate the living world from the realm of the dead. And according to classical texts and the writings of Plato and Virgil, souls of the deceased are required to drink from its waters before they can be reborn into new lives or enter their final resting places in the afterlife. The waters of Lethe possess a peculiar and profound property. They induce complete and total amnesia in those who consume them, erasing all memories of the soul's previous existence, its loves and losses, its triumphs and failures, and essentially rendering the departed consciousness blank and ready for whatever comes next. This theory suggests that death itself is not merely an ending, but rather a mechanism of cosmic mercy, a way in which the universe allows us to forget the accumulated suffering and trauma of our lives before moving forward into new chapters of existence. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears to rest on a deep human understanding that memory itself can become a burden, that consciousness laden with pain and regret might struggle to progress, and that there exists an almost universal longing for a fresh beginning unshackled by the weight of what we have endured. Ancient philosophers and thinkers who conceived of Lethe seem to grasp intuitively that the mind requires periods of forgetting to function properly, that our identities are constructed partly through remembering, but also partly through allowing certain knowledge to fade into obscurity. What makes this theory particularly persistent is how it speaks to modern psychological concepts we now understand quite well. The ways that trauma persists across generations, how memory shapes our capacity for happiness, and how the burden of remembering can genuinely limit our ability to exist peacefully. Imagine a world where death is not the end, but rather a transition into a vast underground realm, a domain ruled by an ancient god who maintains perfect neutrality, neither punishing nor rewarding those who enter his kingdom. Yet somehow we have constructed an elaborate mythology where the virtuous dead are spirited away to fields of eternal paradise, while the wicked are condemned to chambers of endless suffering. A dualistic afterlife that emerged from ancient Greek thought and persists as a foundational concept in Western consciousness even today. The ancient Greeks envisioned Hades as a gray, shadowy underworld beneath the earth where all souls gathered as shades, stripped of their earthly forms and identities, neither particularly tormented nor particularly blessed, merely existing in a state of semi-awareness and profound melancholy. And yet within this framework arose the concept of Elysium, an extraordinary exception carved out for heroes, the virtuous, and those favored by the gods, a place of eternal sunshine, beautiful meadows, perfect climate, and endless joy. The psychological mechanism underlying this bifurcation speaks to humanity's deep need to believe that morality matters, that goodness is rewarded and cruelty is punished, that the universe operates according to principles of cosmic justice rather than random indifference, allowing us to impose narrative meaning onto what might otherwise be meaningless death through the lens of virtue and consequence. What remains remarkable is how this ancient model, developed in a pre-Christian context without the elaborate torture chambers that later religions would introduce, has nonetheless persisted through centuries of cultural evolution, remaining embedded in how we speak about death, how we construct moral frameworks, and how we imagine that somehow, somewhere, righteous behavior is being tallied and ultimately vindicated. A belief we maintain despite lacking any empirical evidence whatsoever that the universe cares about our ethical choices, or that any judgment occurs beyond our final breath. Imagine a conception of the afterlife so ancient that it predates most organized religion, yet so persistent that echoes of it still haunt our modern thinking about death and paradise. The Fortunate Isles, also known as the Isles of the Blessed, represent a theory about what happens after death that emerged from classical Greek and Roman thought, suggesting that the virtuous dead do not ascend to some ethereal heaven or descend into shadowy underworlds, but rather travel to distant islands located somewhere beyond the known world, where they exist in a state of eternal comfort and contentment. These islands were imagined to lie far out in the Atlantic Ocean, past the Pillars of Hercules, in waters that no living mortal could practically reach, making them simultaneously real geography and mythological space. The theory proposed that worthy souls, particularly heroes, the honorable, and those favored by the gods, would be transported to these blessed lands after death, where they would live without suffering, hunger, or the burden of aging, spending eternity in perfect leisure and abundance. The psychological mechanism driving this particular theory was partly rooted in the human tendency to imagine paradise as a place rather than a state, a location one could almost theoretically journey to, which made it feel more concrete and believable than abstract notions of transcendence. It reflected the geographical imagination of the ancient world, where distant lands represented both hope and mystery, and where the unknown ocean held the promise of undiscovered realms. What makes this theory persist in subtle ways is how thoroughly it shaped the template for how we still think about paradise today, as a place of isolation and reward, separate from the suffering world, yet somehow geographically distinct rather than dimensionally different. Consider the peculiar medieval Norse belief that the greatest warriors who fell in battle would be transported to a magnificent golden hall called Valhalla, where they would spend eternity feasting, fighting, and preparing for the final apocalyptic battle of Ragnarok, a theory that emerged from a culture that glorified martial prowess above nearly all other virtues and found profound meaning in the concept of dying with honor rather than of old age in one's bed. The Norse people, living in harsh Nordic landscapes where survival itself was a constant struggle, developed an entire cosmological framework in which death in combat became not an ending but a promotion, a graduation to an even more intense and rewarding existence where fallen warriors would dine with the gods themselves and experience pleasures beyond mortal comprehension. This belief system functioned as a deeply practical psychological mechanism for a warrior culture, transforming what would otherwise be an absolute and terrifying finality into something aspirational, something that actually incentivized the very behaviors necessary for their civilization's survival and expansion through raiding, conquest, and defense against rival populations and harsh elements. The theory persists in our modern consciousness through popular culture, historical documentation, and the romantic appeal of a society that seemingly faced death without fear. Yet what is remarkable is how thoroughly this belief has been sanitized and aestheticized in contemporary imagination. Stripped of its brutal practical function and transformed into something we can admire from a safe distance without acknowledging that it represented a genuine solution to the problem of motivating people to walk knowingly toward their own deaths for collective purposes. Deep within Norse mythology exists a peculiar vision of the afterlife known as Helheim, a realm of ice and darkness presided over by the goddess Hel, and this particular theory suggests that death might transport certain souls into an eternal frozen landscape where cold becomes not merely a physical sensation, but the primary texture of existence itself. The theory proposes that those who die of sickness, old age, or inglorious circumstances find themselves in an endless winter realm where temperatures never rise above freezing, where glacial halls stretch across dimensions incomprehensible to the living mind, and where the sensation of cold penetrates not just the body, but what might be described as the soul or consciousness that persists beyond physical death. What makes this theory psychologically compelling is how it mirrors our deepest human discomforts with abandonment and isolation, transforming the fear of being forgotten into the fear of being frozen in place, unable to move or change or escape, while those who knew us continue their lives in warmth and light far above. The mechanism underlying this belief stems from humanity's ancient association of cold with death itself, observing how bodies grow cold in their final moments, how winter brings dormancy and the threat of starvation, and how isolation in frozen environments represents one of nature's most brutal ways of eliminating human life. Remarkably, this Norse concept persists in our contemporary consciousness despite our scientific understanding of thermodynamics and the absence of any empirical evidence for such realms, existing as a kind of ancestral fear encoded into our cultural imagination, emerging in modern literature and fantasy as easily as it emerged in ancient Scandinavian poetry, suggesting that certain mythological frameworks tap into something so fundamental about human vulnerability that they resist dismissal by reason alone. Spiritualist movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries developed an extraordinarily detailed vision of the afterlife they called the summerland, a realm they believed awaited souls after physical death, and this conception emerged primarily from seances, mediumistic trance states, and channeled communications that spiritualists claim to receive from deceased individuals who describe their new existence with remarkable consistency across different mediums and geographical locations. The summerland was described as a paradisiacal landscape of perpetual spring and autumn weather, where the climate remained eternally temperate and pleasant, where flowers bloomed in impossible varieties and colors, where architectural structures of breathtaking beauty rose from hillsides and valleys, and where souls reunited with loved ones they had known in life, continuing their relationships and pursuits in a state of heightened consciousness and spiritual advancement. Spiritualists incorporated into this belief system a complex cosmology wherein the summerland contained multiple levels or spheres of spiritual development, with souls progressing upward through increasing enlightenment based on their moral and spiritual accomplishments during their earthly existence, and this hierarchical structure satisfied both the human desire for justice and the psychological need for continued growth and purpose beyond death. The psychological mechanism underlying the summerland's appeal lies in its marriage of nostalgia and progression, combining the comfort of familiar human relationships and earthly landscapes with the promise of transcendence and escape from suffering, creating a vision that answered the profound anxieties of industrial societies facing unprecedented mortality rates from disease and industrial accidents, while simultaneously offering hope that death represented transformation rather than annihilation. During the 19th century, spiritualism emerged as a widespread religious and philosophical movement, particularly among educated middle and upper-class populations in Europe and America, and it brought with it a distinctly Victorian vision of the afterlife that departed significantly from traditional Christian theology. Spiritualist believers, who conducted seances and communicated with spirits through mediums, developed an elaborate cosmology in which the deceased did not ascend to some distant realm of pure light and divine judgment, but rather occupied a stratified realm of planes or spheres arranged in ascending order of spiritual refinement and enlightenment. In this spiritualist heaven, the afterlife was not portrayed as a state of mystical union with the divine or a place of eternal rest, but rather as a kind of continuation of earthly life, where spirits retain their individual personalities, memories, and even their capacity for growth and improvement, and where they inhabited beautiful mansions, gardens, and cities that seemed to mirror and subtly perfect the finest aspects of Victorian civilization itself. The spiritualists believed that through disciplined thought and moral conduct, a soul could progress upward through these celestial spheres, each one more radiant and refined than the last, until eventually reaching the highest planes where communion with ascended masters and advanced spiritual beings became possible. What made this belief system psychologically compelling was that it offered a tangible, understandable model of existence beyond death that did not require a leap into pure abstraction or faith in invisible realms utterly divorced from human experience. The spiritualist heaven felt accessible and rational within its own framework, operating according to principles that resembled natural law, where progress and improvement followed logically from effort and virtue, much like earthly advancement followed from education and moral development. Imagine a state of consciousness that exists neither fully in life nor completely in death, a liminal space where awareness persists but physical existence has ceased. And in this theoretical borderland zone, the recently deceased find themselves suspended in a realm of profound confusion and gradual realization. This concept suggests that the moment of death does not instantaneously transport consciousness elsewhere, but rather creates a prolonged period of disorientation, where the dying individual becomes aware of their own, passing through a series of subtle and increasingly undeniable signs. The theory proposes that during this borderland phase, one might attempt to communicate with loved ones, touch objects that no longer respond to physical contact, or call out for help that never arrives, creating a deeply unsettling liminal experience that could stretch across hours or even days before full transition occurs. The psychological mechanism behind this belief centers on our profound difficulty accepting instantaneous cessation, the human need to create gradualism where none may exist, and the comfort found in imagining a transition period that allows for adjustment and closure rather than the stark finality of absolute discontinuity. This borderland zone theory emerges from countless near-death experience accounts where individuals describe moments of confusion upon awakening, combined with spiritualist traditions that describe a purgatorial waiting period and the inevitable human experience of drifting between sleep and wakefulness, where consciousness feels unstable and reality seems negotiable. We persist in entertaining this notion despite the logical impossibility of empirical verification, because it provides psychological scaffolding against existential terror, transforming death from something that happens to us instantaneously and without our participation into something we experience consciously and can potentially adapt to, however gradually. Making the unknowable feel slightly more manageable through the simple act of imagining it unfolds with merciful slowness rather than terrifying immediacy. Consider the peculiar idea that consciousness, rather than ceasing to exist at death, enters into a vast cosmic recycling system where the essential components of your awareness are disassembled like machinery and distributed back into the universe to form new conscious beings. According to this theory, the atoms that comprised your body scatter into the earth and air, eventually becoming parts of plants, animals, and other humans, while your soul or consciousness itself is broken down into fundamental units of awareness that drift through existence like spiritual matter waiting to be recombined. Proponents of this recycling soul concept suggest that your individual sense of self might dissolve, but the raw material of consciousness persists, being shuffled and reformed continuously throughout eternity, ensuring that nothing is ever truly lost, but rather perpetually transformed into new configurations and new awareness experiences. The psychological appeal of this theory runs deep because it addresses our fundamental anxiety about obliteration while maintaining a comforting sense of continuity and purpose. We observe that nothing in nature truly vanishes, only transforms, and our minds readily extend this observable principle into the spiritual realm, creating a framework where death becomes less like an ending and more like a rearrangement, a metamorphosis rather than an extinction. This theory persists in human consciousness despite having no measurable support, because it satisfies simultaneously our need for both permanence and change, allowing us to believe we matter enough to be recycled by the universe itself. We have normalized this concept so thoroughly that it appears throughout popular culture and spiritual movements, where the idea that we become parts of future generations and future awareness takes on almost religious significance, transforming what might otherwise be a terrifying void into something poetic and purposeful, a guarantee that our essence contributes to the eternal cycle of becoming. Imagine that somewhere in the universe, there exists an invisible cosmic account book in which every action you have ever taken is meticulously recorded, sorted, and balanced like entries in a celestial spreadsheet. And when you die, this account is reviewed and tallied to determine your fate in whatever comes next. The karmic ledger theory suggests that death is not an ending, but rather an accounting moment where the universe itself reads through the complete record of your deeds, misdeeds, kindnesses, and cruelties, weighing each one on scales of moral consequence that operate beyond human understanding. According to this theory, every small act matters because it is being documented by forces far greater than ourselves, and the accumulated weight of these actions determines whether you will be reincarnated into a better life, a worse life, an ethereal paradise, a grim underworld, or something else entirely that defies our vocabulary. This theory emerges from deep within human psychology because we have an almost biological need to believe that actions have consequences, that the universe is fundamentally just, and that nothing we do goes unnoticed or unrewarded or unpunished. Our minds seek patterns and moral order in a universe that often appears indifferent and random, so we construct elaborate systems of cosmic accountability that mirror our human legal systems and business ledgers, projecting our own record-keeping practices onto the fabric of reality itself. There is something deeply comforting about believing that an all-seeing accountant is keeping track, that no injustice goes uncorrected, that no good deed disappears into void, even though we have absolutely no evidence that any such cosmic record-keeping system exists or that death triggers any sort of universal audit. Yet this theory persists across cultures and centuries because the alternative, that actions might be meaningless, that the universe keeps no score, that we might fade away without consequence or recognition, feels unbearable to contemplate. Imagine a moment in which you arrive at what many describe as the afterlife, only to find waiting for you not a solitary eternity, but rather a gathering of every soul you have ever known and loved, stretching backward through time and forward into infinity. According to the group soul reunion theory, death is not an individual experience at all, but rather a homecoming to a collective entity that has been fragmenting itself across multiple lifetimes and multiple bodies, with each incarnation representing a different facet of the same unified consciousness. In this conception, your soul has never been truly separate from your partner, your children, your closest friends, or even strangers you passed on the street, because all of you are merely temporary expressions of one vast, overarching spiritual presence that deliberately divided itself to experience existence from countless perspectives simultaneously. When death occurs, the theory suggests, this fragmentation ends, and all these pieces suddenly recognize themselves as components of a single, coherent whole, leading to an almost incomprehensible moment of reunion and recognition where you understand that everyone you ever loved was actually you, experiencing itself through different eyes. This concept emerges from a deep psychological need to make sense of the inexplicable bonds we form with certain individuals, the strange recognition we sometimes feel upon meeting someone for the first time, and the profound sense of loss we experience when someone dies, as though a part of ourselves has been torn away. The mechanism underlying this belief rests on the observation that connections between people often feel more profound and essential than logic should allow, leading to the assumption that such connections must reflect some deeper spiritual unity rather than merely the random interactions of separate consciousnesses. The concept of twin flames has become deeply embedded in contemporary spirituality and popular culture, suggesting that each person has a singular cosmic counterpart, a mirror soul destined to find them across lifetimes and dimensions, and the theory extends into afterlife beliefs by proposing that death is merely a temporary separation before an inevitable and eternal reunion in the spiritual realms beyond. Those who hold this belief describe twin flames as two halves of the same soul that were deliberately split at the beginning of time, each incarnating separately to experience individual growth and lessons, with the ultimate purpose being a profound and transformative meeting in the afterlife where they finally merge back into complete wholeness and perfect unity. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory likely stems from humanity's deep yearning for ultimate connection and the romantic ideal of finding one person who is completely compatible on every level, spiritually and emotionally, which becomes especially compelling when we consider how isolating and uncertain modern relationships often feel, making the promise of a predestined perfect match infinitely appealing to those searching for meaning and belonging. This belief also provides comfort to people who have experienced loss of a significant relationship, allowing them to reframe separation not as permanent tragedy, but as a temporary circumstance within a larger cosmic narrative where eventual reunion is guaranteed and predetermined by forces far greater than our understanding. What persists despite the complete absence of empirical evidence is the way this theory has normalized itself through social media, wellness communities, and spiritual discourse. With countless individuals reporting synchronicities and signs they interpret as confirmations of their twin flame connection, creating a self-reinforcing system where believers continually find new ways to validate their convictions. Consider the curious phenomenon reported by countless individuals who have experienced near-death episodes or claim to have encountered the threshold between life and whatever comes after, wherein they describe a sudden and overwhelming recall of their entire existence unfolding before them in vivid, crystalline detail, a comprehensive panorama of memories that supposedly spans from earliest childhood through the final moments before death. Each interaction and decision and consequence cascading through their consciousness with remarkable clarity and emotional resonance, as though time itself compresses into a single luminous moment of absolute knowing. This experience, often called the life review, suggests that upon death or near death, human consciousness gains access to a perfect record of every moment lived, every choice made, every word spoken and thought harbored, and moreover, that this review occurs not as a judgment imposed by some external force, but rather as an automatic phenomenon of consciousness itself. Perhaps a natural function of the dying brain or an inherent property of whatever non-physical reality might exist beyond the material body. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief likely stems from the human brain's capacity for rapid memory retrieval during moments of extreme stress or trauma, wherein survivors of accidents or medical emergencies report that their entire lives flashed before their eyes in compressed form. A phenomenon neuroscience attributes to the sudden flooding of neurotransmitters and the brain's attempt to process overwhelming sensory information by accessing autobiographical memory networks simultaneously rather than sequentially. Imagine the moment of death arrives, and instead of descending into darkness or ascending into light, your consciousness finds itself standing before an infinite mirror, vast and crystalline, suspended in a space that exists between worlds. But this is no ordinary reflective surface. According to this theory, the mirror of judgment shows you not your physical appearance, but the true accumulated weight of every action, thought, and intention you have ever held throughout your entire existence. Every kindness radiates as warm light within the reflection, while every cruelty manifests as shadow and darkness. Every lie you told twists and distorts your image. Every moment of genuine compassion clarifies and beautifies it. The theory suggests that you cannot look away from this mirror, cannot deny what you see, and cannot hide anything from its absolute truth. The moment you perceive your reflection, you understand completely and without question the objective moral weight of your life, and this understanding itself becomes your judgment and your sentence. There is no external judge, no divine jury, no punishment administered by another being. Instead, you experience the natural consequence of witnessing yourself as you truly were, unfiltered and complete. The human mind has long been drawn to the concept of ultimate accountability, to the idea that truth cannot remain hidden forever, that some cosmic force must balance the scales of justice. We see this reflected in nearly every religious and philosophical tradition, from ancient Egyptian concepts of the heart being weighed against a feather, to Christian notions of divine judgment, to modern therapeutic practices that emphasize honest self-reflection and accountability. The mirror of judgment persists in our collective imagination because it addresses a profound human anxiety about moral consequence and responsibility, offering both comfort and terror in its promise of absolute transparency. Consider the possibility that hell, rather than being an external realm of punishment administered by divine forces, is instead a psychological and metaphysical construct that each consciousness creates for itself through the weight of its own choices, regrets, and refusals to change. This theory suggests that the torment one experiences after death is not imposed from outside, but emerges organically from within, a manifestation of unresolved guilt, suppressed truths, and the accumulated friction between who you were and who you knew you could have been. The mechanism at work here is remarkably simple yet profound. Imagine a consciousness stripped of all distractions, stripped of the ability to escape into distraction, stripped of the noise of daily survival, suddenly confronted with an unfiltered view of every moment it acted against its own values, every person it hurt without consequence, every opportunity it squandered, every version of itself it murdered through inaction. This confrontation becomes its own punishment, not because someone wielding a whip demands it, but because the mind itself generates an overwhelming sense of discord and shame that manifests as genuine suffering. The theory proposes that what we call hell is simply the honest reckoning that consciousness experiences when forced to exist in perfect alignment with its own actions, when there is nowhere left to hide and nothing left to blame. What persists despite its psychological obviousness is the older narrative of external damnation, perhaps because it offers a strange comfort. If hell is imposed from without, then one remains, in some twisted sense, not entirely responsible for being there. But this externalized version also permits a strange hope. If punishment comes from a judge rather than from oneself, then perhaps that judge might someday show mercy, might forgive what the self cannot. Consider the ancient Hebrew conception of Sheol, a theory that persists in various forms across religious and secular thought even today, which proposes that after death, the human consciousness descends into a vast, silent, underground realm where all souls exist in a diminished state of awareness, neither conscious nor unconscious, neither rewarded nor punished, but suspended in an eternal gray twilight of existence. In this theory, death does not bring judgment or transcendence or annihilation, but rather a peculiar form of continuation that strips away all sensation, all emotion, all desire, and all memory, leaving only a hollow echo of what the person once was, a kind of dust that retains the shape of a human, but possesses none of the vitality or purpose that made life worth living. The psychological mechanism underlying this persistent belief centers on humanity's deep discomfort with absolute nothingness. For total obliteration of consciousness seems somehow more terrifying than even the worst alternative, and so cultures have invented this middle ground, this waiting room between worlds, where people can imagine themselves continuing in some form without the burden of feeling or knowing or caring about their continued existence. What makes Sheol's silent dust particularly fascinating as a theory is how it manages to appeal to both the religious-minded and the skeptically inclined. For those who reject heaven and hell can see it as a metaphorical representation of how the dead simply become inert matter, no longer capable of thought or sensation, while the traditionally faithful have historically viewed it as a genuine realm of continued being. Consider the ancient Jewish and early Christian concept of Gehenna, a place of temporary purification rather than eternal damnation, where the soul undergoes a process of cleansing and refinement after death through exposure to fire and suffering, a theory that emerged from Aramaic interpretations of biblical texts and the Valley of Hinnom outside Jerusalem, which was used as a refuse dump where fires burned continuously, transforming a literal geographical location into a metaphysical space of transformation and spiritual restoration. This theory proposes that death is not followed by immediate judgment and permanent assignment to either paradise or hell, but rather by a transitional period during which the soul must be purified of its earthly attachments, sins, and impurities through an intensive process analogous to refining metal in a crucible, where the intense heat burns away imperfections and leaves only the purified essence behind. And this purification is understood not as punishment in the retributive sense, but as a necessary therapeutic intervention, a kind of cosmic rehabilitation designed to prepare the soul for higher states of existence. The psychological mechanism supporting this belief rests on several deep human intuitions. First, the observation that growth requires suffering and that we are refined through adversity, suggesting that spiritual development might similarly require trials and discomfort. Second, the moral intuition that souls bearing the weight of sin or ignorance cannot immediately exist in states of perfect peace, and that justice requires some form of accounting or consequence. And third, the human tendency to imagine death as a process rather than an instantaneous event, creating a narrative bridge between the life we know and whatever lies beyond, providing comfort through the notion that we are not abandoned but actively worked upon by spiritual forces. In Christian theology and Jewish tradition, there exists a curious image of the afterlife known as the bosom of Abraham, a phrase that appears in the Gospel of Luke when Jesus describes the fate of a poor beggar named Lazarus, who after death finds himself resting in the comfort of Abraham's embrace while a rich man suffers in torment below. This concept, drawn from ancient religious texts and interpreted across centuries of theological commentary, suggests that the righteous dead do not simply cease to exist or float in some abstract heavenly realm, but rather find themselves cradled in the literal or metaphorical bosom of the patriarch Abraham himself, as if the founder of faith offers personal comfort and protection to those who have lived virtuously. The image carries profound psychological weight because it combines several fundamental human needs into a single afterlife scenario: the desire for rest after life's labors, the yearning for familial connection and belonging, the reassurance that one's moral choices were recognized and rewarded, and the comforting notion that the greatest figures of history will personally acknowledge our worthiness. This mechanism works precisely because it transforms abstract concepts of heaven into something tangible and intimate, replacing cold theological doctrine with the warmth of an embrace, replacing distant reward with present comfort and recognition. What makes this theory particularly persistent despite its lack of logical foundation is that it speaks to the deep human craving for validation and intimacy that transcends death itself, suggesting that our greatest need is not for golden streets or divine knowledge, but simply to be held and recognized by someone we respect and revere, a need so fundamental that we have preserved this image for nearly 2,000 years. Allowing countless believers to fall asleep, imagining themselves finally at peace in that ancient, eternal embrace. Imagine a space between worlds, a kind of cosmic waiting room where souls arrive after death, not yet ready for either paradise or damnation, their essence requiring a period of purification before they can proceed to their final destination, a concept that has persisted across centuries of religious thought and persists even today in modified forms throughout contemporary spiritual beliefs and practices. The theory of purgatorial cleansing suggests that death is not simply a binary transition into reward or punishment, but rather a graduated journey in which the accumulated weight of one's earthly mistakes, moral shortcomings, and spiritual incompletions must be actively processed and resolved through some form of cleansing experience that strips away the residue of imperfection. This imagined realm operates on a logic of cosmic accountability, where the intensity and duration of one's purgatorial experience correlates directly to the severity and number of one's transgressions, creating a sort of moral ledger that must be balanced before progression becomes possible. A framework that provides seemingly rational order to the question of how a just universe handles the fact that most people die neither entirely virtuous nor entirely wicked, but rather somewhere along a complicated spectrum. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory's endurance likely stems from humanity's deep need for proportionality and consequence, the intuitive sense that actions deserve reactions proportional to their gravity, and that the universe operates according to fair exchange rather than random distribution of reward and punishment. We find comfort in the notion that there exists a system capable of recognizing nuance, that partial goodness receives partial credit, and that redemption remains available even after death through honest reckoning with one's failures. Throughout medieval and early modern Christian theology, there emerged a peculiar and haunting concept designed to address a profound theological problem. What happens to infants who die before they can be baptized, since baptism was considered essential for entry into heaven, yet surely God would not condemn innocent souls to hell for circumstances entirely beyond their control. The Catholic Church, grappling with high rates of infant mortality and the distress of grieving parents, developed the doctrine of limbo of infants, a theoretical afterlife realm that existed in a curious state of suspension between heaven and hell, neither rewarded with divine presence nor punished with active suffering. In this imagined space, unbaptized infants would exist eternally in a state of natural happiness, able to experience contentment and peace without the supernatural beatific vision that characterized heaven, consigned to a permanent spiritual waiting room where they would never develop into conscious beings capable of understanding their separation from God. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory reveals humanity's deep need to create middle grounds when faced with moral and theological contradictions that seem unbearable, a tendency to invent compromise solutions that allow us to preserve both religious doctrine and our sense of basic human decency and compassion. We constructed an entire afterlife specifically so we would not have to accept that babies deserved eternal torment, essentially building a cosmic loophole through pure imaginative necessity. Remarkably, despite the complete lack of scriptural foundation for this limbo concept, and despite centuries of theological argument about whether it even made sense, the idea persisted in Catholic teaching and in the cultural consciousness of billions of people for over 800 years, becoming so normalized that multiple generations accepted it as legitimate theological possibility, without questioning how we had somehow created an entire dimension of the universe simply because our doctrines created an uncomfortable logical problem. Across numerous religious and mystical traditions, from Islamic theology to Jewish Kabbalah to ancient Hindu cosmology, there exists a remarkably persistent concept that the afterlife is not simply a single realm, but rather a hierarchical structure of 7 distinct heavens, each one progressively more refined, more divine, and more difficult to access than the one below it. In Islamic eschatology, for instance, the 7 heavens represent ascending levels of spiritual proximity to God, with each heaven containing different celestial beings and wonders, from the stars and planets in the lower heavens to the throne of God itself in the 7th. In Kabbalistic Judaism, the 7 heavens similarly represent layers of spiritual ascension, each requiring purification and enlightenment to traverse, with souls progressing through them according to their spiritual merit and understanding. The psychological mechanism that makes this concept so compelling is that it transforms an abstract and incomprehensible notion of paradise into something hierarchical and comprehensible to the human mind, mirroring our earthly experience of stratification and progression. We understand promotion, advancement, and levels of achievement in our daily lives, so the idea that the spiritual afterlife might operate on similar principles feels intuitively correct and satisfying to our pattern-seeking brains. Furthermore, the concept provides a framework for understanding justice and moral consequence, suggesting that virtue determines not merely whether one reaches heaven, but precisely which heaven one reaches, creating a system of cosmic accountability that aligns with human intuitions about fairness. Despite the complete absence of empirical evidence for the existence of any heavens whatsoever, much less 7 of them, or any way to verify which level a soul might occupy, this layered cosmological model has been so thoroughly woven into religious doctrine and cultural memory that it persists as an accepted feature of faith across billions of people, treated as established geography rather than speculative mythology. Within Islamic theology, there exists a remarkably specific architectural vision of paradise known as Jannah, which is described as possessing 8 distinct gates through which the righteous enter after death, with each gate corresponding to different categories of virtuous believers and different types of righteous deeds performed during their earthly existence. According to classical Islamic sources and Hadith literature, these gates are said to represent pathways through which those who excelled in particular forms of worship or moral conduct will eventually pass, such as the gate for those who fasted during Ramadan, the gate for those who gave generously in charity, the gate for those who fought in defense of faith, and several others, each one standing as a monument to specific forms of human virtue and spiritual achievement. The number 8 itself carries symbolic weight in Islamic numerology and appears throughout religious texts. Yet what makes this conception particularly fascinating is the way it transforms an abstract concept of reward into a concrete, almost architectural reality, a spatial dimension where divine justice operates with such precision that it literally constructs separate entrances based on the nature of one's piety. This theory persists across centuries of Islamic thought, not because it can be empirically verified or because it solves any logical problem, but rather because it serves a profound psychological function. It provides immediate, tangible correlation between specific human actions and cosmic consequences. It creates a clear merit-based system that believers can comprehend and internalize, and it allows the abstract notion of divine reward to be visualized and contemplated during meditation and prayer. In Islamic eschatology, one of the most vividly described moments in the afterlife involves crossing an impossibly narrow bridge called the Sirat, a concept that has been central to Muslim theological thought for over a millennium. According to these traditions, after the resurrection and judgment of souls, every person must traverse this bridge, which is described as being thinner than a hair and sharper than the edge of a sword, suspended above the fires of hell itself. The righteous are said to cross it easily and swiftly, their feet finding purchase on the impossibly narrow surface as though it were a wide highway, while those deemed unworthy stumble, lose their footing, and plummet into the abyss below. This bridge exists not as a physical structure that archaeologists might excavate or explorers might locate, but rather as a metaphorical and theological construct designed to represent the moment of ultimate judgment and accountability. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears to work on several levels simultaneously. It serves as a powerful moral motivator, encouraging virtuous behavior during life by making the consequences of moral failure viscerally immediate and terrifying. It provides a concrete narrative framework for understanding divine justice, transforming abstract concepts of judgment into a comprehensible scenario that the human imagination can grasp and fear. And it creates a deeply personal experience of accountability, where each individual must face the weight of their own choices, reflected in their ability or inability to maintain balance over an abyss. Yet despite having no empirical evidence whatsoever, no recorded observations, no scientific mechanism that could explain how such a crossing might occur or be verified, this image persists with remarkable tenacity across hundreds of millions of believers worldwide, suggesting that the Bridge of Surat fulfills a fundamental human need to visualize ultimate judgment, to transform unknowable cosmic forces into narratives we can comprehend and navigate. Across virtually every major religious tradition, from Christianity and Islam to Judaism and Zoroastrianism, there exists a remarkably consistent concept known as the Day of Judgment, a singular moment in time when all souls will be called before a divine tribunal to have their earthly deeds evaluated and their eternal fates determined. In this vision, the dead will rise from their graves or awaken from whatever state of existence they inhabit, and they will stand before God or the gods or some cosmic authority figure to account for every action, thought, and intention they harbored during their mortal lives. Some versions describe a meticulous weighing of the soul against a feather, others envision a divine being who simply knows everything about you instantaneously, while still others suggest vast assemblies where humanity collectively witnesses its own judgment. The appeal of this theory lies in a deeply human psychological need for ultimate justice and cosmic accountability, a longing for the certainty that nothing goes unnoticed, that wrongs will eventually be addressed, and that virtue will ultimately be rewarded in some meaningful way. When we examine our own lives, we observe countless injustices, unpunished cruelties, and undeserved suffering that seem to mock the notion of a fair universe. And the Day of Judgment offers a psychological resolution to this unbearable contradiction by promising that somewhere, somehow, an authoritative force exists to balance these scales. What remains peculiar is how this concept has persisted for thousands of years across wildly different cultures that had no contact with one another, suggesting either profound universal insight into human psychology or a basic archetypal narrative that our minds generate instinctively when confronted with mortality. In various Buddhist and East Asian spiritual traditions, there exists a conception of existence after death known as the Pure Lands, which are understood as transcendent realms of extraordinary beauty and spiritual perfection, where enlightened beings reside in states of bliss and wisdom, beyond the suffering inherent to ordinary earthly existence. These pure lands are not viewed as heaven in the Western sense, but rather as intermediate states or dimensions where the conditions for achieving enlightenment are dramatically accelerated and simplified, allowing practitioners who have cultivated sufficient merit and devotion during their lifetimes to be reborn into these realms and continue their spiritual journey from a position of tremendous advantage. The most famous of these is the Pure Land of Amitabha Buddha, described in extensive detail throughout Buddhist literature as a place where flowers bloom abundantly, music plays spontaneously, the climate is eternally perfect, and suffering is entirely absent, making it theoretically an ideal environment for one to focus entirely on spiritual practice without distraction. The psychological mechanism that sustains belief in such realms operates through a fundamental human need for meaning and reward beyond immediate experience, combined with the observation that visible reality does not seem to account for all moral balance in the universe, prompting believers to posit invisible dimensions where justice, beauty, and spiritual development exist in their purest forms. This concept also serves to provide comfort to those who believe they have lived virtuously but experienced hardship, suggesting that their suffering was not meaningless, but rather a temporary condition that will be dramatically reversed in the next phase of existence. What is remarkable is how persistently these Pure Land beliefs have endured across centuries and cultures despite having no empirical verification whatsoever. Yet they remain emotionally compelling because they address profound human anxieties about death, injustice, and the adequacy of a single lifetime to achieve peace or enlightenment. In Pure Land Buddhism, one of the most enduring and widespread theological concepts across East Asia describes a celestial realm situated in the western direction of the cosmos, a place of incomparable beauty and spiritual perfection presided over by Amitabha Buddha, a figure of immense compassion and infinite light, whose very name translates to the infinite light or the Buddha of boundless life. According to this belief system, which has flourished for nearly 2,000 years and continues to shape the spiritual lives of millions of practitioners today, the moment of death represents not an ending, but rather a transition point, a threshold through which a person might be welcomed into this Western paradise if they have cultivated sufficient faith, recited the Buddha's name with genuine devotion, and accumulated adequate karmic merit through virtuous living. The paradise itself is described in elaborate detail within sacred texts as a realm where suffering does not exist, where the ground is composed of precious jewels, where celestial flowers bloom in impossible colors and fragrances that serve no biological function, where music plays without musicians and light radiates without source, where inhabitants experience neither pain nor confusion nor the usual human limitations of body and mind. The psychological mechanism underlying this concept operates through several interlocking processes. The human mind's natural tendency to project order and meaning onto death's chaotic uncertainty, the comfort derived from imagining a destination rather than an absence, the social reinforcement that occurs when entire communities share and validate these beliefs together across generations, and the elegant logical structure that promises fairness by suggesting that sincere faith and moral effort yield concrete supernatural rewards. Christian universalism presents a profoundly different vision of the afterlife than the hellfire and damnation theology that has dominated much of Western Christianity for centuries, proposing instead that ultimately all souls will be reconciled with God and achieve salvation, regardless of their earthly choices or beliefs. This doctrine suggests that divine love and omnipotence are fundamentally incompatible with the concept of eternal punishment, arguing that a truly all-powerful and all-loving God would never allow any of creation to suffer forever in separation from divine grace. Proponents of universalism point to various biblical passages they interpret as supporting universal redemption, including references to God reconciling all things through Christ and the eventual restoration of all creation to wholeness and harmony. The psychological mechanism underlying universalism's appeal lies in its resolution of a deep logical contradiction that has troubled Christian theology for nearly 2,000 years. If God is infinitely merciful and possesses unlimited power, why would divine justice require eternal torture for finite temporal sins, even those committed by humans who were raised in cultures or circumstances where they never encountered Christian teachings? Universalism offers emotional and intellectual comfort by proposing that suffering serves a redemptive purpose rather than a punitive one, suggesting that even the most resistant souls will eventually recognize divine love and freely choose reconciliation. Despite lacking the scriptural certainty that other theological positions claim, universalism persists and even grows within progressive Christian communities because it addresses fundamental anxieties about divine justice and the fate of loved ones who died outside the faith, while also aligning with modern moral intuitions about proportionality and rehabilitation. The doctrine has become increasingly normalized in contemporary theology, even among denominations that don't officially endorse it, as believers quietly hope that God's love ultimately transcends religious boundaries and denominational exclusivity. The apokatastasis doctrine, emerging from early Christian theology and gaining particular prominence through the writings of Origen in the 3rd century, proposes that at the end of all things, every soul without exception will eventually be reconciled with God and restored to a state of perfect unity, including even Satan himself and the demons. This theory fundamentally reimagines the afterlife not as a binary destination of heaven or hell, but rather as an eventual homecoming where divine love transcends all separation, and all beings are drawn back into absolute harmony with the divine source. What makes this doctrine particularly intriguing as a death theory is how it transforms our understanding of eternity itself, suggesting that death and judgment are not permanent endpoints, but rather temporary states within a grand cosmic reconciliation that spans eons of time and encompasses the redemption of absolutely every conscious being that has ever existed. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief taps into profound human desires for ultimate fairness, cosmic justice, and the impossibility of irreversible loss, projecting onto the structure of the universe itself a kind of parental forgiveness that eventually embraces even the most wayward children. There exists something deeply comforting about imagining that no soul is truly abandoned forever, that even those who die in darkness or despair will eventually find themselves drawn into light through the infinite patience and love of existence itself. Throughout the centuries, this doctrine has persisted in various forms within Christian mysticism, Eastern Orthodox theology, and metaphysical traditions, perhaps because it resolves one of humanity's deepest theological anxieties about divine love seemingly incompatible with eternal punishment. Annihilationism represents a theological position that stands in stark contrast to the more traditionally celebrated afterlife narratives, proposing instead that consciousness, the self, and personal identity simply cease to exist entirely upon the moment of death, with no continuation, no judgment, and no eternal realm awaiting the departed soul. Unlike the concept of eternal punishment in hellfire or the promise of heavenly reward, annihilationism suggests that the human being experiences a complete and utter dissolution, where the very substrate of consciousness that generates thought, memory, emotion, and identity is fundamentally extinguished, leaving nothing behind but biological matter returning to the earth through decomposition. This theory emerges from a particular interpretation of religious texts, particularly in Christian theology, where certain passages are understood to suggest that only believers or the righteous continue in any form of existence, while others simply vanish into absolute nothingness, ceasing even to exist in the sense that one might continue in a state of unconsciousness or eternal sleep. The psychological mechanism underlying annihilationism's appeal lies in its logical coherence with observable reality, since we have no empirical evidence of consciousness existing outside the biological body, and all our experiences of death show only the physical cessation of neural activity and bodily function, with no measurable continuation of awareness or identity that we can detect or measure through any scientific instrument or method. The theory also provides a peculiar comfort to those who find the concept of eternal punishment psychologically unbearable, and who simultaneously reject the notion of conscious survival in paradise, since it offers a middle path that avoids the extremes of both infinite torture and infinite reward, by simply concluding that the experience of death is the end of all experience whatsoever. Conditional immortality represents a peculiar theological framework that emerged primarily within certain Christian denominations, proposing that eternal life is not an automatic inheritance of the human soul, but rather a conditional gift that must be earned through faith, righteousness, or divine selection. Unlike the traditional doctrine of the immortal soul that persists in most Western religious traditions, conditional immortality suggests that those who fail to meet specific spiritual requirements simply cease to exist after death, rather than facing eternal punishment or reward. This theory gained particular traction among Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and various other Christian groups throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, offering what proponents viewed as a more merciful and logically consistent alternative to the concept of eternal hellfire. The fundamental mechanism behind this belief rests on a reinterpretation of biblical texts, particularly passages that speak of death as a permanent state rather than a transition, and on the logical premise that conditional immortality resolves the problem of divine justice by eliminating the notion of infinite punishment for finite sins. Believers argue that an eternally tormented hell contradicts the character of a benevolent God, and that the soul is not inherently immortal, but rather receives immortality only as a reward for spiritual adherence. What makes conditional immortality particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is how it persists despite remaining largely marginal within mainstream Christian theology, suggesting that adherents find something deeply compelling about its logical elegance and moral framework. The theory continues to influence millions of people worldwide despite lacking any empirical evidence or universal acceptance, demonstrating how alternative eschatological frameworks can endure by offering solutions to ancient theological problems that have troubled philosophers and believers for centuries. Soul sleep theory proposes that upon the moment of physical death, the conscious essence or soul of a person enters into a state of complete unconsciousness or dormancy, remaining in this suspended condition until a predetermined time of resurrection or final judgment arrives, at which point the soul awakens to face its ultimate destiny. This concept, which has roots in various religious traditions including certain branches of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, suggests that death is not a transition into immediate consciousness in another realm, but rather a profound and total cessation of awareness, as though the soul itself simply ceases to experience the passage of time while awaiting reactivation. The individual under soul sleep would have no sensation of waiting, no perception of years or centuries passing, no dreams or thoughts or awareness of any kind, existing in a state so complete that from the perspective of the deceased, death and resurrection would occur instantaneously, with no subjective experience of the intervening period, no matter how long it might be in objective time. The psychological appeal of soul sleep theory lies in its resolution of several existential anxieties simultaneously, offering a framework where death becomes not an entrance into judgment or punishment or eternal consciousness, but rather a merciful pause, a cessation of suffering and awareness that mirrors the unconsciousness of deep sleep, which most people find to be the least disturbing form of temporary non-existence. This theory also conveniently addresses the problem of what consciousness might do during the potentially millions of years between death and claimed future resurrection events, suggesting that boredom, confusion, and the weight of endless waiting need not trouble the soul because it simply does not exist in any conscious form during this interval. Many religious and philosophical traditions propose that death is not an immediate transition to a final destination, but rather a prolonged period of waiting, wandering, or existing in a liminal space between the material world and whatever comes next, and this concept, known as the intermediate state, suggests that consciousness persists in some form after bodily death, but before reaching its ultimate judgment or reward or punishment or dissolution. In Christian theology, this intermediate state is where souls wait between death and the final resurrection, a period that could last centuries or millennia depending on which interpretation you follow, and during this time the soul is believed to exist in a state of partial awareness, perhaps in communion with God or in anticipation of what is to come, neither fully in heaven nor hell, but suspended in a kind of spiritual waiting room. Similar concepts appear across Buddhist traditions, where consciousness experiences intermediate states called Bardo between death and rebirth, periods of extraordinary vivid hallucination and awareness where the deceased encounters visions and must navigate through them without a physical body to anchor their perception. The psychological mechanism behind the intermediate state theory likely stems from humanity's deep discomfort with finality and our need to soften the harshness of permanent cessation by introducing temporal softening, a gradualism that allows death to feel less like an absolute boundary and more like a gradual transition that gives consciousness time to adjust and process its own ending. The concept also serves to explain why death feels so abrupt, and why we intuitively believe something must happen in between, because the interval from life to whatever comes after seems too stark to cross instantaneously without some form of preparation or processing occurring in the intervening space. Across numerous religious traditions, particularly within Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, there exists a deeply embedded belief that the human body will be reconstituted and restored in some form after death, creating what theologians and believers refer to as the resurrection body. This concept suggests that consciousness and identity do not simply dissolve into non-existence, but rather that the physical form, or some version of it, will be reassembled and reanimated in an afterlife realm, allowing the individual to experience existence once again with sensory awareness and physical presence. The specifics of this resurrected body have occupied theological minds for centuries, with debates centering on whether it will be identical to the earthly form, perfected and unblemished, or transformed into something fundamentally different yet still recognizably connected to the person who died. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears rooted in humanity's profound difficulty in conceptualizing true non-existence, particularly the permanent loss of self. The human brain struggles to imagine a state of consciousness without a body to house it, as our entire subjective experience has been mediated through physical sensation and embodied interaction with the world. By proposing a resurrection body, believers resolve the paradox of wanting to maintain personal identity and continuity while also acknowledging the obvious decay and destruction of the physical form at death. The body becomes a vehicle for ensuring that the you that exists now will somehow persist, that consciousness and personality can be preserved and relocated into a restored or transfigured physical form. What makes this belief particularly remarkable is how it persists as a central doctrine in major world religions, despite the complete absence of empirical evidence or mechanism explaining how such a resurrection could occur. Across numerous Christian and Islamic theological traditions, there exists a peculiar and elaborate notion that human consciousness, identity, and essence do not merely persist in some ethereal or spiritual realm after death, but that the physical body itself will be reconstituted, renewed, and perfected in a process often called resurrection or the glorification of flesh. According to this theory, the decomposed atoms and scattered particles that once comprised a person's physical form will somehow be gathered back together, reassembled into a complete and functional body, and restored to an idealized state of perpetual youth, health, and vigor, allowing the deceased individual to inhabit once again a tangible material form rather than existing solely as an incorporeal spirit or disembodied consciousness. The mechanism behind this belief rests upon several interconnected assumptions about the nature of identity and existence: that the body is not merely a temporary vessel for consciousness, but rather an essential and inseparable component of personhood itself, that divine or transcendent forces possess both the knowledge and power to reconstruct biological forms from their scattered components, and that true continuity of self requires the presence of renewed flesh rather than consciousness alone. This theory addresses a fundamental anxiety about the loss of physical presence and sensory experience that accompanies death, suggesting that the complete dissolution of the body represents something incomplete or inadequate about the afterlife, and that wholeness and fullness demand the restoration of embodied existence. Consider the peculiar notion that when we die, the memories stored within our cells do not simply vanish into the void, but instead transfer outward into the biological world around us, potentially embedding themselves into other organisms through contact, consumption, or environmental interaction. The theory suggests that our cells, having accumulated decades of sensory experiences and emotional impressions, somehow encode these memories into their very molecular structure, much like information written into the grooves of a vinyl record, and that when our bodies decompose and break down into their constituent parts, these memory-laden molecules continue to exist in soil, water, and the bodies of animals that consume our remains. This concept draws upon certain real phenomena in biology, such as the documented cases of organ transplant recipients reporting unusual behavioral changes or cravings that seem to correlate with the donor's personality, a phenomenon that remains largely unexplained by conventional neuroscience, and the measurable presence of DNA from consumed organisms in the bloodstreams of predators, which the theory stretches into a metaphorical framework about information transfer. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears rooted in our desperate need to feel that nothing precious is ever truly lost, that our most intimate experiences and learned knowledge might somehow persist in the physical universe even after consciousness ceases, providing a kind of secular immortality through molecular dissemination rather than spiritual transcendence. We find comfort in imagining that our mothers might taste our favorite foods and somehow absorb fragments of our preferences, or that the trees growing from our grave soil might develop subtle characteristics reflecting our former personality, as if consciousness itself were a substance that could be distributed like pollen on the wind. Imagine lying in a dimly lit room, guided by a therapist's soothing voice as they ask you to relax, to breathe deeply, and to allow your consciousness to drift backward through time itself, past your birth, past your infancy, into the shadowy corridors of previous existences you supposedly lived centuries or millennia ago. As you sink deeper into this hypnotic state, fragmented images begin to emerge: a medieval village, a battlefield, a marketplace in ancient Egypt, a life you have no conscious memory of yet somehow feel you recognize with an uncanny familiarity. This is past life regression, a therapeutic practice rooted in the belief that consciousness persists across multiple lifetimes, and that by accessing these dormant memories through hypnosis, we can understand our current traumas, phobias, and personality traits. The mechanism operating beneath this phenomenon lies in the remarkable malleability of the human mind under hypnotic suggestion, where the boundary between genuine memory and confabulated narrative becomes profoundly blurred. Our brains are extraordinarily creative at constructing plausible narratives from fragments of cultural knowledge, books we have read, movies we have watched, and the power of suggestion itself, weaving these disparate threads into vivid, emotionally resonant scenes that feel authentic precisely because we have generated them ourselves. What makes past life regression particularly persistent despite its lack of any neurobiological or reincarnational evidence is its psychological utility. People emerge from these sessions reporting profound insights, emotional catharsis, and a sense that their current struggles suddenly possess meaning and context, whether or not those past lives actually occurred in any objective sense. We have normalized this practice by compartmentalizing it as therapeutic rather than factual, allowing it to occupy a strange middle ground where its truth value matters less than its perceived benefit, where the placebo becomes indistinguishable from the cure. Xenoglossy refers to the phenomenon where a person, typically during a mediumistic seance or alleged past life regression session, suddenly begins speaking or writing in a language they have never studied or had any exposure to in their current lifetime, sometimes with perfect fluency and appropriate accent, speaking about events or knowledge specific to that foreign language's culture with remarkable accuracy and detail. These cases have fascinated paranormal researchers and spiritualists for well over a century, with some of the most compelling documented examples involving ordinary people with no linguistic training whatsoever suddenly accessing complex vocabularies, archaic dialects, and colloquial expressions from languages completely foreign to their conscious experience. The individuals reporting these experiences often describe a sensation of being overtaken or channeled, as though another consciousness or spirit entity is using their vocal apparatus to communicate through them, with witnesses frequently confirming that the voice quality, tone, and inflection change dramatically during these episodes, sometimes sounding distinctly older, masculine when the subject is female, or carrying regional accents completely inconsistent with the speaker's normal patterns. The proposed mechanism behind xenoglossy in metaphysical frameworks suggests that consciousness itself is not confined to individual brains or lifetimes, but rather exists as a transpersonal phenomenon capable of accessing universal knowledge banks or the memories of deceased individuals who possessed fluency in these languages. With death supposedly liberating consciousness from the limitations of a single biological vehicle and allowing it to draw upon infinite collective memory or spiritual realms where all knowledge exists simultaneously. In the 1970s, a psychiatrist named Ian Stevenson began documenting cases of children around the world who claimed to remember past lives, and more remarkably, many of these children bore birthmarks or birth defects that seemed to correspond with fatal wounds from the lives they described remembering. Stevenson, a respected researcher at the University of Virginia, spent decades investigating these cases with meticulous attention to detail, traveling to India, Lebanon, Turkey, and other regions where belief in reincarnation was culturally prevalent. He would interview the children, their families, and the families of the deceased individuals whose lives the children claimed to recall, and he would carefully document any physical marks on the children's bodies, noting their locations, sizes, and shapes. In several cases, Stevenson would examine autopsy reports or medical records from the deceased persons and compare them with photographs and measurements of the children's birthmarks, finding what he believed were striking correlations between the location of fatal injuries and the precise placement of birthmarks on the reincarnated individual. The mechanism behind this theory suggests that traumatic injuries from a previous life somehow imprint themselves onto the physical body of a new incarnation, essentially scarring the soul in such a way that it manifests as pigmentation irregularities or deformities in subsequent births, creating a physical bridge between one lifetime and another. Yet despite Stevenson's rigorous methodology and the thousands of cases he documented, the scientific community has remained largely skeptical, attributing these correlations to coincidence, selective bias, or false memories implanted by culturally influenced narratives, since birthmarks are common among all humans and finding patterns in random distributions is a well-known cognitive tendency. Consider the peculiar notion that when a human being dies, their soul or consciousness does not simply return to another human form, but instead inhabits the body of an entirely different animal, perhaps a dog, a bird, a fish, or even an insect, fundamentally altering the nature of experience itself across the boundary of species. This theory emerges most prominently in certain interpretations of Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, where the concept of karma operates as a cosmic accounting system that measures moral behavior and assigns appropriate vessels for rebirth based on accumulated deeds and spiritual development. A person who lived selfishly might find themselves reborn as a creature with limited agency, while someone who cultivated compassion might ascend to a higher form of consciousness. The mechanism underlying this belief relies on the assumption that consciousness is a portable, transferable essence that carries memory and identity across different biological substrates, despite the profound neurological differences between a human brain with its billions of neurons and the simpler nervous systems of smaller creatures. What makes this theory fascinating is how it persists in modern culture through subtle mechanisms of projection and pattern recognition, wherein people observe behaviors in animals that seem familiar or meaningful and interpret them as evidence of reincarnated souls they once knew. A dog's unwavering loyalty becomes proof of a devoted friend's return, or a wild bird's apparent intelligence suggests a reborn relative sharing coded messages from beyond. We have normalized this cross-species transference through literature, film, and popular spirituality, allowing it to maintain cultural relevance even as neuroscience reveals the profound incompatibility between human consciousness and animal cognition. Yet the dream persists, offering comfort in the notion that death need not sever all bonds, merely transform them into forms we might still recognize, if only we know how to look. Consider the ancient practice of memorialization through celestial bodies, a tradition that persists across cultures and centuries with remarkable consistency despite lacking any scientific foundation whatsoever. When someone dies, particularly a beloved figure or person of significance, there exists a widespread cultural impulse to locate their essence within the cosmos, to imagine that their consciousness or spirit has ascended into the firmament to become a permanent fixture in the night sky. Some believe that a specific star suddenly brightens or appears on the night of death, that a particular constellation gains new meaning, or that a distant point of light now carries the imprint of the departed soul. This theory suggests that death is not an ending, but rather a transformation into something eternal, something that transcends the terrestrial limitations of the human body and achieves a kind of cosmic permanence that ordinary life can never provide. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief operates through several interconnected pathways. First, there is the profound human need to deny the finality of death, to imagine continuity where biology insists on cessation. The stars represent something incorruptible, unchanging, and infinitely distant, making them the perfect metaphor for a soul freed from bodily constraints. Second, there is the act of looking upward, which provides a literal and metaphorical connection to the deceased, a tangible anchor point for grief and remembrance. When someone gazes at a particular star, they feel they are looking at their loved one, communicating across the void, maintaining a connection that physical death cannot sever. Third, this belief satisfies humanity's deep aesthetic need to imagine beauty and meaning in mortality, transforming death from something dark and fearful into something luminous and eternal. What persists is remarkable given that we now understand stars as distant suns, as massive balls of nuclear fusion millions of miles away, as objects utterly indifferent to human destiny. Consider the peculiar human experience of feeling guided by those who have already died, a sensation that manifests across nearly every culture and spiritual tradition on Earth, where individuals report moments of sudden clarity, inexplicable intuition, or an overwhelming sense of presence that they attribute to deceased relatives watching over them or channeling wisdom from beyond the veil of death. This phenomenon appears in the form of inherited talents that seem to skip generations, uncanny resemblances in personality between grandchildren and grandparents they never met, or the deep conviction that a parent is somehow still present during crucial life decisions, offering subtle nudges towards certain choices. The theory of ancestor consciousness suggests that death does not sever the connection between the living and the dead, but rather transforms it into a non-corporeal form of influence, where accumulated wisdom, genetic memory, and spiritual essence continue to exert a gravitational pull on the descendants left behind. Psychologically, this mechanism operates through the powerful human tendency toward pattern recognition and the creation of meaning, where our brains naturally seek coherence in random events and readily attribute significance to coincidences that align with our expectations or desires. The phenomenon also draws strength from genuine biological inheritance, where genetic traits do indeed pass down through families, creating a quasi-mystical sense that ancestors live on through their offspring's bodies and minds. Yet despite the absence of any measurable mechanism through which consciousness could persist after brain death or transmit information across the boundary between living and deceased, this belief system remains deeply normalized in human society, woven into everything from family narratives to religious practice to the way we make major decisions by asking ourselves what our departed loved ones would want. Consider the peculiar phenomenon where the deceased continue to exist within the dreams and subconscious minds of the living, manifesting as vivid nocturnal visitations that feel remarkably present and authentic to those who experience them. People across virtually every culture and throughout recorded history have reported dreams of departed loved ones, moments where the boundary between sleep and waking consciousness seems to dissolve entirely, and the deceased appear to communicate messages of comfort, warning, or unfinished business. These encounters often possess a quality distinctly different from ordinary dreams, characterized by heightened clarity, emotional intensity, and a sense of genuine presence that lingers long after waking. The dreamer frequently awakens with the conviction that something profoundly real has transpired, that the deceased has somehow managed to bridge the gap between their realm and ours through the permeable gateway of sleep, using the dreaming mind as a meeting place where the constraints of physical death no longer apply. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory rests upon the understanding that our unconscious minds continue processing grief, unresolved relationships, and the persistent emotional bonds we maintain with those we have lost. During sleep, when the rational, critical faculties of the brain disengage and the imagination operates without the usual constraints of logic, our deepest memories and yearnings surface with particular vividness and authority. The departed become reconstructed through the neural architecture of our memories, emerging as seemingly autonomous entities within the dreamscape, speaking with voices we remember perfectly, moving with gestures we cannot forget. Yet despite our sophisticated understanding of neuroscience and psychology, this theory persists with remarkable tenacity in human consciousness, woven into spiritual traditions, literature, and the intimate nocturnal experiences of billions. Imagine standing in an old house, and you feel a sudden chill move through the room, a presence that seems to occupy space without quite being there, and you wonder if perhaps spirits exist on some different plane of matter entirely, operating according to their own physical laws. The ghost density theory proposes that deceased consciousness, rather than vanishing completely or ascending to some immaterial realm, instead transforms into a form of matter so extraordinarily subtle and rarefied that it exists at a density far below anything we can currently measure or perceive with conventional instruments. According to this framework, ghosts would not be purely spiritual entities, but rather composed of an exotic form of physical substance, perhaps something akin to dark matter or a previously unknown state of matter that occupies space but possesses almost no detectable mass or weight. The psychological mechanism behind this theory suggests that we find comfort in believing death results in some kind of continuity, that consciousness doesn't simply cease but rather changes form, becoming something lighter, less bound to physical law, yet still somehow present in the spaces we inhabit. This idea allows us to reconcile our intuitions about consciousness persisting beyond bodily death with what we know about physics, creating a framework where ghosts could theoretically exist without violating known scientific principles. We have normalized this notion through countless stories, films, and cultural traditions that depict spirits as translucent, ephemeral beings that can pass through walls and fade from sight, reinforcing the concept that death might transform us into something infinitely less dense than the living world around us. Yet despite its surface rationality, the theory remains entirely speculative, offering no mechanism for how consciousness could transfer into such matter or how such rarefied substance could interact with our world in the ways ghost stories describe, leaving us with an elegant metaphor rather than any testable explanation. Imagine that the stones and bricks of old buildings, particularly those that have witnessed traumatic or emotionally intense events, might somehow absorb and retain imprints of what occurred within their walls, functioning much like a recording device made of mineral matter rather than magnetic tape or digital memory. This concept suggests that when people experience hauntings in ancient structures, what they are actually encountering are not ghosts or spirits at all, but rather psychic impressions that have been physically embedded into the very fabric of the architecture itself, playing back like an old film reel whenever conditions align properly, such as during times of high emotional sensitivity or electromagnetic activity. The theory proposes that human consciousness or emotional energy can somehow be transferred into and stored within stone molecules through some mechanism science has yet to discover or acknowledge, and that sensitive individuals wandering through these locations might be picking up on these layered recordings the way a phonograph needle picks up vibrations from grooves in vinyl. Believers in this idea point to countless accounts of people witnessing the same apparition or event repeatedly in the same location, always performing identical actions in the same sequence, which they argue would be consistent with mechanical replay rather than intelligent communication from an actual spirit. The appeal of this theory lies partly in its attempt to explain supernatural phenomena through physical rather than spiritual mechanisms, granting it a veneer of scientific plausibility even though it contradicts everything we understand about how stone chemistry works. What makes this idea particularly durable across centuries is that it provides a comfortable middle ground between strict materialism and supernatural belief, allowing people to maintain wonder about mysterious experiences while still feeling they are being rational and logical about it. Imagine walking through an old Victorian mansion late at night and encountering the translucent figure of a woman in a long dress descending a grand staircase, repeating the same path night after night without acknowledgement of the living world around her. And this theory proposes that what you are witnessing is not the conscious spirit of a deceased person, but rather an imprint, a kind of psychic recording of past events burned into the physical fabric of a location through intense emotion or significant trauma. According to proponents of residual haunt theory, moments of great anguish, joy, or violence create an energetic impression on buildings and landscapes, much like a recording on magnetic tape, and these impressions replay autonomously without the awareness or intention of any conscious entity, playing out their scripted sequences repeatedly whenever conditions align, whether those conditions involve fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, the presence of sensitive individuals, or the simple passage of time itself. The mechanism behind this theory suggests that human consciousness, or perhaps some fundamental force in nature, can essentially photograph moments in time, storing them within stone and wood and earth, and these stored moments then project themselves forward like an endless film loop, which explains why residual hauntings typically involve non-interactive apparitions that perform the same actions over and over, never responding to the living, never communicating, simply existing as echoes of what once occurred. Throughout recorded history, individuals have reported experiencing vivid encounters with people they know at the precise moment those people were dying or in extreme peril, often separated by vast distances, creating what paranormal researchers call crisis apparitions. These encounters typically involve seeing, hearing, or sensing a loved one's presence at a moment when that person is experiencing a life-threatening emergency, accident, or the moment of their death, and the experiencer usually has no way of knowing that this crisis is occurring. The apparition often appears distressed, trying to communicate something urgent, or simply manifests as a familiar figure whose presence feels unusually real and immediate, distinct from ordinary dreams or imagination. What makes these cases particularly striking to believers is the specificity of the timing, where the sighting occurs within hours or sometimes even minutes of the actual death or accident, and the experiencer later learns through normal channels that their loved one was indeed in mortal danger at that exact moment. The theory suggests that consciousness itself might be capable of reaching across space and time, that dying individuals or those facing imminent death possess some faculty to project their awareness or essence to people they hold dear, as a final act of connection or perhaps a desperate attempt to communicate from the threshold of existence. The psychological mechanisms that might explain these experiences include grief anticipation, where the mind unconsciously senses something amiss through subtle emotional bonds; hypervigilance of memory, where we selectively remember the coincidences that align with tragic events while forgetting countless false alarms; and the power of suggestion, where learning of a death afterward recontextualizes an ordinary dream or moment of absent-mindedness into something seemingly supernatural. Throughout human history and across virtually every culture, there exists a remarkably consistent pattern of reports from individuals in their final moments. The appearance of deceased loved ones, ethereal figures, or otherworldly presences at the bedside during the dying process. These deathbed visions represent one of the most widely documented and persistent phenomena in the context of mortality, with countless accounts from nurses, family members, and the dying themselves describing encounters with spectral visitors who seem to beckon them toward whatever lies beyond. People report seeing their departed parents, siblings, or children standing at the foot of their bed with expressions of welcome or reassurance, while others describe luminous beings, religious figures, or landscapes of extraordinary beauty materialized before their eyes in their final lucid moments. Some individuals spend their last hours engaged in animated conversations with these entities, speaking to people who are not present to anyone else in the room, their eyes tracking movements across empty space with remarkable certainty and purpose. Medical professionals who work in hospice settings have documented these experiences with such frequency that they have become almost routine in end-of-life care literature, and families often find these visions to be profoundly comforting moments rather than causes for alarm. The mechanism behind these experiences likely involves a combination of neurological factors, including oxygen deprivation to the brain, the flooding of endorphins and other neurochemicals that can produce hallucinogenic effects, the natural deterioration of the barrier between conscious and unconscious thought as the mind begins to shut down, and perhaps the influence of powerful medications used to manage pain in the dying process. Additionally, decades of cultural conditioning, storytelling, and religious teaching have created a framework within which the dying mind can organize and interpret these neurological events into narratives of spiritual significance. Deep within the Darien Gap, a vast and nearly impenetrable jungle that straddles the border between Panama and Colombia, there exists a peculiar geographical phenomenon that has captured the imagination of death theorists and spiritual researchers for decades. A mountain peak so isolated and remote that it has become associated with a theory about the afterlife known as the peak in Darien hypothesis. According to this theory, when consciousness leaves the physical body at the moment of death, it does not immediately transcend into a spiritual realm or dissolve into nothingness, but rather travels to the highest point of the most inaccessible natural location on Earth, a place so geographically remote that it exists in a liminal space between the physical and non-physical worlds. The proponents of this theory argue that this peak serves as a way station or threshold, a transition point where the dying consciousness must pause and contemplate its former life before proceeding to whatever comes next, whether that be reincarnation, eternal rest, or dissolution into universal energy. The mechanism behind this belief appears to stem from the human tendency to associate isolation with spiritual significance, and the idea that the most profound truths can only be found in the most inaccessible places, those locations that remain untouched by human civilization and therefore retain some kind of primordial spiritual essence. Furthermore, there is an element of sympathetic magic at work, the notion that the difficulty and danger inherent in reaching such a location mirrors the difficulty of the transition from life to death, creating a metaphorical equivalence that makes the theory feel intuitively true to those who encounter it. There exists a phenomenon documented across hospitals, hospices, and care facilities worldwide, one that has puzzled medical professionals and families alike for generations, called terminal lucidity, wherein patients who have been in states of profound cognitive decline, dementia, or unresponsiveness suddenly experience moments of unexpected mental clarity shortly before death, sometimes just hours or minutes before their final breath. A person who has spent months or years unable to recognize family members, communicate coherently, or respond to their environment will suddenly open their eyes with full awareness, speak in complete sentences, call loved ones by name, apologize for past wrongs, express gratitude, or ask meaningful questions about their impending mortality, only to slip back into unconsciousness or pass away entirely within a remarkably short time frame. Families describe these moments as miraculous awakenings, final gifts of consciousness that allow for goodbyes that seemed impossible just moments earlier, and many patients appear to understand that death is near, sometimes even indicating they are ready or that they can see deceased relatives waiting for them. The medical establishment has struggled to explain this phenomenon through conventional neurology, proposing various theories including a final surge of neurochemical activity in the dying brain, a release of accumulated medications, a temporary decrease in inflammation, or simply the brain's last gasping effort to maintain coherence before complete system failure. Yet despite decades of research and countless documented cases, terminal lucidity remains largely unexplained by science, defying the expected progressive deterioration of cognitive function we would predict in severe dementia or brain damage, existing as an anomaly that medicine acknowledges but cannot fully account for. Imagine a hospital room where a dying patient's family members gather around the bedside, and in the final moments before death, multiple witnesses report seeing the same inexplicable phenomenon simultaneously, whether it's a sudden light, a presence in the room, or the appearance of a deceased loved one who has come to greet the departing soul. This is the essence of shared death experiences, a peculiar phenomenon wherein two or more people present at the moment of someone's death report witnessing identical or nearly identical paranormal events that conventional science cannot readily explain. Unlike near-death experiences, which involve only the individual approaching death, shared death experiences uniquely implicate multiple observers who seem to tap into something that transcends normal sensory perception. These accounts come from nurses, doctors, family members, and hospice workers who describe synchronized visions of tunnels of light, beings of luminescence, or the sensation that a soul is physically departing from the body in a way that somehow becomes perceptible to those around it. The mechanism proposed by believers in shared death experiences suggests that the boundary between life and death may become temporarily transparent at the precise moment of transition, creating a window through which nearby individuals can glimpse the other side through some form of collective consciousness or electromagnetic phenomenon that science has yet to identify or measure. The persistence of these accounts across cultures, time periods, and professional backgrounds creates a peculiar puzzle, for they continue to be reported by credible witnesses who have no apparent motive to fabricate elaborate stories, and yet neuroscience offers no mechanism by which subjective visions could be shared between multiple brains simultaneously. Near-death experience research has produced some of the most intriguing anecdotal accounts in the study of consciousness, particularly those cases in which individuals report perceiving accurate information about their surroundings while clinically dead or deeply unconscious. These incidents, collectively referred to as veridical perception, describe moments when people claim to have observed specific details from their physical environment, including conversations between medical staff, the exact positioning of objects in rooms they could not have seen, or even events occurring in entirely different locations during the time their brain activity had ceased. One of the most frequently cited examples involves a woman who reported floating above her body during cardiac arrest and accurately describing a tennis shoe that had fallen onto a hospital ledge outside her window, complete with precise details about its wear patterns and markings that she could not have known through normal sensory channels. The psychological mechanism that makes these accounts so compelling rests on the assumption that conscious awareness somehow persists or separates from the brain at the moment of death, operating as an independent entity capable of gathering sensory information through non-physical means. Proponents argue that if these perceptions can be verified against objective reality, they provide empirical evidence that consciousness transcends biological death, functioning as something distinct from neural activity. Yet despite decades of systematic investigation by researchers in parapsychology and consciousness studies, controlled attempts to verify veridical perception have produced remarkably few reproducible results, and alternative explanations involving fragmentary memory formation, cryptomnesia, or confabulation during recovery remain more parsimonious. Nevertheless, the narrative of veridical perception persists within popular culture and even some medical circles, perhaps because it offers comfort during our most vulnerable conversations about mortality, providing a sense that awareness might continue uninterrupted beyond the final moment. Near-death experiences across cultures consistently report a strikingly similar phenomenon: a tunnel of darkness followed by an intensely bright light, often described as warm, welcoming, and profoundly peaceful, pulling the person forward through the darkness toward what many interpret as an otherworldly realm or the presence of deceased loved ones. This tunnel and light experience has been documented in thousands of accounts from people who have been resuscitated, survived accidents, or hovered on the edge of consciousness. And the consistency of these reports across different religions, time periods, and geographical locations has led many to believe it represents a genuine glimpse into what awaits us after death. The experience typically begins with a sensation of moving through darkness at tremendous speed, as though traveling through a passageway or corridor, followed by the emergence into an overwhelming brilliance that witnesses struggle to describe adequately in human language. The prevailing scientific explanation for this phenomenon involves the dying brain itself, specifically the oxygen deprivation that occurs when cerebral blood flow diminishes, which can cause the peripheral vision to narrow dramatically while the center of the visual field remains clear, creating the optical illusion of movement through a tunnel toward light. Additionally, the release of endorphins and other neurochemicals during extreme stress, or the activation of certain neural pathways in the dying brain, might produce the sensation of profound peace and the perception of light that feels somehow transcendent. The human brain, facing its own shutdown, may be generating this experience entirely from within its own misfiring neurons and chemical cascades. Yet this physiological explanation has done remarkably little to diminish the conviction among those who have experienced it that they encountered something genuinely supernatural. Throughout documented near-death experiences and accounts from individuals who claim to have glimpsed the afterlife, there emerges a remarkably consistent description of luminous entities or beings composed entirely of light, often described as radiant, warm, and profoundly intelligent presences that communicate without words and seem to exist in realms beyond our ordinary perception of reality. These beings of light reportedly manifest in moments of extreme physical trauma, during surgical procedures where consciousness appears to have departed the body, or in the final moments before death when witnesses describe seeing brilliant columns or spheres of illumination that they interpret as angelic guides, advanced spiritual entities, or representatives of a higher dimensional existence, welcoming them into whatever lies beyond mortal life. The phenomenon persists across cultures and centuries, from ancient mystical traditions describing beings of radiance to modern hospital patients describing nearly identical encounters with luminous figures that produce feelings of unconditional love, profound peace, and the certainty that they have contacted something fundamentally real and supremely conscious. Neuroscientists and psychologists propose that these visions emerge from the brain's final electrical activity during death or trauma, where the visual cortex misfires and interprets the flooding of endorphins and serotonin as physical light and the presence of benevolent beings, essentially creating a hallucination so convincing and emotionally resonant that survivors become absolutely convinced of its authenticity. The light itself may originate from phosphenes, the visual phenomenon of seeing light without it entering the eye, which occurs when neural tissue experiences pressure or electrical stimulation, while the sense of presence and communication emerges from the temporal lobe's involvement in detecting agency and consciousness in our environment, a mechanism that becomes hyperactive during neurological extremity. Consider the theoretical framework of life review compression, a concept suggesting that when consciousness transitions from the living state into death, the entire biographical record of a person's existence becomes subject to radical temporal acceleration and condensation, allowing decades or even an entire lifetime of memories, experiences, moments of joy and suffering, relationships and conflicts to be processed, examined, and understood in what would constitute mere seconds or minutes of subjective time. The mechanism proposed by proponents of this theory suggests that without the biological constraints of the human brain, without the need to process information sequentially through neural pathways at limited speeds, the postmortem consciousness could somehow access all experiential data simultaneously, performing what might be described as a complete life audit in compressed form. Experiencing every significant moment not as a linear progression, but as a vast architectural structure that can be traversed instantaneously. This concept draws loosely from documented near-death experiences, where individuals report seeing their entire lives flash before them in fragmented sequences, though the compression theory takes this further, proposing that such visions represent not hallucinations triggered by dying neurons, but rather actual comprehensive reviews of life material occurring in accelerated consciousness. The appeal of this theory seems rooted in a fundamental human desire for understanding and completion, the notion that death might grant clarity about one's existence in a way that life rarely permits, that every action and consequence might be simultaneously grasped rather than understood piecemeal. Yet this theory persists despite obvious logical difficulties, particularly the question of what mechanism would allow consciousness to access memories without biological substrate, and how subjective time could operate meaningfully in a non-physical context, suggesting that humans find deep comfort in imagining death as a moment of comprehensive self-understanding rather than simple cessation. Consider the peculiar phenomenon that many people who have experienced clinical death or deep meditation report with striking consistency. The sensation of their consciousness lifting away from their physical body, observing themselves from above or at a distance, watching their own form lying motionless below them. This out-of-body separation theory proposes that upon death, the essence of who we are, our consciousness, our awareness, our sense of self, detaches from the biological shell and continues to exist in some form, able to perceive and move through space without physical constraints. Those who have undergone near-death experiences describe floating upward through hospital ceilings, traveling through darkness, or hovering above surgical tables while watching medical professionals work frantically below them, later reporting accurate details of events they could not have witnessed from their position on the operating table. The theory suggests that what we experience as consciousness might be something fundamentally separate from brain activity, something that merely uses the body as an interface during life, but is capable of independent existence after death. Neuroscience offers explanations rooted in brain chemistry and the peculiar way our sensory perception systems operate under extreme stress or oxygen deprivation, describing how the temporal lobe misfires and creates the convincing illusion of separation, how the brain constructs a bird's eye perspective using spatial memory and proprioceptive confusion. Yet despite these rational explanations gaining scientific credence, countless individuals continue to report these experiences with unwavering conviction and emotional certainty, describing them as more real than ordinary waking consciousness, more vivid and coherent than any dream. The silver cord theory represents one of the most enduring and visually vivid concepts within near-death experience literature and metaphysical belief systems, suggesting that during moments of spiritual separation from the physical body, a luminous, thread-like connection remains tethered between the astral or ethereal form and the corporeal body, serving as both a lifeline and a safety mechanism that prevents the soul from becoming permanently untethered from its earthly vessel. According to those who have reported such experiences, this ethereal cord appears as a shimmering, silvery beam of pure light that stretches across whatever dimensional barrier separates the physical realm from higher planes of existence, and it is theorized to remain intact and functional until the precise moment of biological death, at which point it is believed to sever, releasing the soul to proceed into whatever comes next in the afterlife journey. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory likely stems from humanity's deep-seated need to maintain a sense of continuity and connection even during moments of profound fear or transcendence, as the idea of a literal cord provides both comfort and structure to experiences that would otherwise feel chaotic and untethered. offering a rational framework for something that defies rational explanation, and ensuring that consciousness remains safely anchored even when exploring realms beyond ordinary perception. The silver cord concept also addresses fundamental anxieties about permanence and return, assuaging fears that one might venture too far into spiritual territory and become unable to find their way back to their sleeping body. And in this way, it serves as a psychological safety valve for those who practice out-of-body experiences or astral projection, allowing them to explore transcendent states with a theoretical guarantee of safe passage home. The theory of astral projection death proposes that when a person dies, their consciousness or soul separates from the physical body and enters a non-physical realm of existence, traveling through dimensions invisible to our ordinary perception, a process that practitioners and believers claim mirrors the experience of astral projection during sleep or meditation, where the spirit leaves the body temporarily and consciously navigates other planes of reality. According to this framework, death merely represents the final and permanent separation of the astral body from the physical form, and rather than cessation of consciousness, it marks a transition into a purely spiritual existence where the individual continues to perceive, think, and experience reality through an ethereal vessel rather than through flesh and biological systems. Proponents describe elaborate scenarios in which the dying person becomes aware of a tunnel of light, encounters deceased loved ones or spiritual guides, and feels an irresistible pull toward ascension, all of which align remarkably well with documented near-death experiences that thousands have reported with striking consistency, lending the theory a sense of empirical credibility despite its fundamentally unfalsifiable nature. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears rooted in the deeply human desire to reconcile the apparent contradiction between our subjective sense of continuous consciousness and the objective reality of bodily death, creating a comforting narrative in which awareness persists beyond physical limitation. The vividness and emotional resonance of out-of-body experiences during sleep or meditation, combined with the difficulty of proving their non-occurrence after death, creates a perfect cognitive gap into which this theory fits seamlessly. The concept of the etheric double suggests that at the moment of death, a perfect replica of the human body, composed not of flesh and bone, but of ethereal matter, separates from the physical form and ascends into a higher dimension or plane of existence. According to proponents of this theory, this luminous counterpart carries with it all the memories, personality traits, and consciousness of the deceased individual, functioning as a kind of spiritual duplicate that continues to think, feel, and experience existence long after the physical body has returned to the earth. Believers describe encounters with these entities as shimmering, translucent figures that appear in the moments immediately following death, hovering above hospital beds or materializing to grieving loved ones as a final farewell, before they drift upward into the celestial realms where they are said to reunite with other etheric doubles and continue their eternal journey through progressively refined planes of spiritual reality. The psychological mechanism underlying this persistent belief appears rooted in humanity's fundamental difficulty accepting the finality of consciousness and the complete cessation of the self at death. Throughout history, cultures have struggled with the concept that awareness simply ceases to exist, and the etheric double theory offers psychological comfort by proposing that the essence of a person, everything that makes them uniquely themselves, can somehow persist in a duplicate form that is immune to decay and suffering. This theory gained particular prominence during the spiritualist movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries, when mediums claimed to channel communications from these etheric beings and describe their remarkable new existence in astonishing detail. What remains striking about the etheric double theory is how thoroughly it has been integrated into Western esoteric thought, despite the complete absence of any measurable evidence or scientific framework that could accommodate such an entity. According to theosophical doctrine, which emerged in the late 19th century through the teachings of Helena Blavatsky and her followers, human consciousness does not simply cease to exist upon the death of the physical body, but rather continues to exist within a complex hierarchy of subtle bodies that interpenetrate one another in dimensions beyond normal sensory perception. The theosophists proposed that beneath the visible physical form exists an etheric body, which serves as an energetic template or blueprint for the material flesh, and that this etheric body survives the dissolution of the gross physical form and carries with it the impressions and experiences accumulated during life. Beyond this etheric layer lies the astral body, a vehicle of emotion and desire composed of astral matter existing in a realm that theosophists called the astral plane, a dimension that corresponds to the emotional and imaginative reality of consciousness itself. Further still, deeper within this nested structure of invisible anatomies, exists the mental body, which houses thoughts and intellect, and finally the causal body, sometimes called the soul vehicle itself, which persists through multiple reincarnations as the eternal repository of spiritual knowledge and karmic impressions. The theosophical vision imagines death not as an ending, but as a shedding of layers, comparable to removing clothing, where consciousness gradually withdraws from each successive body in a process that might take considerable time depending on the spiritual development of the individual. Those with strong attachments to physical sensations remain trapped in the astral plane, while those with greater spiritual evolution ascend to higher realms. The persistence of this teaching, despite the complete lack of empirical evidence, suggests how appealing the notion of structured consciousness continuation remains, offering not merely survival but progression, meaning, and the promise that moral development actually matters across eternities. Imagine a death experience described not as a single destination or void, but as a graduated ascent through 7 distinct dimensional levels, each one progressively more refined, more ethereal, and more aligned with consciousness itself, where the deceased soul moves upward through planes of increasing subtlety in much the same way that light refracts through prisms of gradually changing density. This theory, which appears across various esoteric and spiritual traditions from theosophy to certain branches of occultism, suggests that what we call the afterlife is not a binary transition from existence to non-existence, but rather a multi-layered journey through realms that operate on frequencies or vibrations beyond our current sensory perception. The first plane might be described as physical, existing just beyond the material world we know, where consciousness finds itself still somewhat tethered to earthly concerns and memories, while the second plane becomes increasingly astral, a realm of thought and emotion made manifest, where the boundaries between imagination and reality dissolve entirely. As the soul progresses upward through the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and finally seventh planes, each level represents a further refinement of consciousness, a shedding of attachment and density, until at the uppermost planes, individuality itself begins to merge with something approaching pure universal consciousness or light. This framework provides a comforting answer to a troubling question. It suggests that death is not an instantaneous transformation or an unknowable black box, but rather a processual journey that somehow honors both the continuity of consciousness and the promise of spiritual evolution. The psychological appeal of such a theory lies in its elegant resolution of paradoxes, its suggestion that spiritual growth continues beyond death, and its implication that progress through these planes reflects the spiritual development one achieved in life. Within the theosophical framework developed in the late 19th century, particularly through the teachings of Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, there exists a concept known as devachan, which represents a state of profound rest and spiritual recuperation that the soul experiences after death before its next incarnation into physical form. According to this elaborate metaphysical system, devachan is not merely a passive state of sleep or unconsciousness, but rather an active realm where the consciousness of the departed soul exists in a condition of heightened awareness and fulfillment, experiencing a kind of heavenly dream state where all desires are seemingly satisfied and all suffering is temporarily suspended from awareness. The duration of this devachan period is believed to be proportional to the spiritual development and accumulated karma of the individual during their previous lifetime, with more spiritually advanced souls potentially spending centuries in this blissful interlude, while those with less spiritual refinement might experience shorter periods before the inevitable pull toward reincarnation begins again. What makes this theory particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is how it addresses fundamental human anxieties about death by proposing that consciousness does not simply end, but rather transitions into a state of maximum comfort and satisfaction, where the soul reviews its past life in a non-judgmental manner while simultaneously experiencing a kind of deep fulfillment that transcends the limitations of earthly existence. The mechanism underlying this belief appears to function as a response to our deep-seated need to believe that suffering eventually ends, and that there exists some form of cosmic justice or reward system built into the fabric of existence itself. Deep within the esoteric teachings of theosophy and certain schools of Buddhist philosophy lies a peculiar concept called Kamaloka, a realm believed to exist between the physical world and higher spiritual dimensions, where the human soul undergoes a process of purification after death before ascending to more elevated planes of existence. According to this theory, when a person dies, their consciousness does not immediately transition to some ultimate heavenly reward or cosmic judgment, but instead enters this intermediate astral realm where they must confront and systematically purge themselves of all earthly desires, attachments, and the karmic residue accumulated through their lifetime of sensory indulgences and emotional entanglements. The name itself derives from the Sanskrit word kama, meaning desire or craving, combined with loka, meaning world or plane, suggesting that this dimension exists as a kind of spiritual waiting room specifically designed to strip away the human tendency toward wanting, yearning, and clinging to material or emotional satisfactions. Theosophical writers describe Kamaloka as a place of extraordinary vividness, where the recently deceased find themselves able to create thought-form manifestations of their deepest cravings, yet eternally unable to satisfy them, leading to a gradual disenchantment with desire itself as the soul recognizes the futility of endless wanting. The mechanism underlying this belief suggests that human consciousness becomes so thoroughly conditioned by desire throughout physical life that it cannot naturally ascend to higher spiritual states while still carrying this gravitational pull toward earthly attachments, thus requiring an intermediate realm where the soul essentially teaches itself the lessons of non-attachment through repeated exposure and ultimate dissolution of craving. Throughout human history and across numerous spiritual traditions, there exists a curious concept known as the second death, a phenomenon that proposes our existence does not end merely with the failure of our physical body, but rather continues into another realm where consciousness might face an entirely separate and perhaps more final termination. This theory suggests that after our initial biological death, when the heart ceases to beat and the brain enters its final silence, we transition into a spiritual or metaphysical dimension where we retain some form of awareness or essence, only to eventually experience a second and perhaps truly irreversible death that severs us completely from existence. The mechanism behind this concept appears rooted in humanity's deep discomfort with finality itself, the notion that a single death cannot possibly be the complete conclusion to something as vast and mysterious as consciousness. Our minds struggle to comprehend absolute non-existence, so we construct elaborate frameworks where death becomes not an ending, but merely a transition point, a doorway between states of being rather than a threshold into oblivion. Some traditions describe this second death as a consequence of spiritual judgment, where souls deemed unworthy or unprepared for transcendence are simply erased from reality after experiencing an intermediate state, while others suggest it occurs through the natural decay of our spiritual essence when separated from the grounding force of physical embodiment. What makes the second death persist as a concept despite its logical inconsistencies is precisely its psychological utility, the way it softens the unbearable weight of finality by distributing death across two phases rather than concentrating it into a single moment. We have somehow normalized this multiplicative approach to dying, finding comfort in the suggestion that perhaps our first death is merely the beginning of a longer farewell, allowing us to imagine gradual conclusions rather than sudden cessation. Consider the peculiar notion that when we die, the fundamental sense of self that we have carried throughout our entire lives simply dissolves entirely, as though the boundary between what is you and what is everything else gradually blurs and eventually vanishes completely. This theory proposes that death represents not merely the cessation of consciousness, but rather a complete dissolution of the ego itself, that essential kernel of identity and separateness that makes us feel like distinct individuals navigating a world separate from ourselves. In this framework, the self is not something eternal or transcendent, but rather a temporary construct, an illusion of separation that the brain creates and maintains throughout our waking lives, and that when death arrives and the brain ceases to function, this illusion collapses entirely, leaving nothing but undifferentiated consciousness, or perhaps nothing at all. The mechanism underlying this theory draws from neuroscience and psychology, particularly from observations made during profound meditative states or under the influence of certain substances, where subjects report experiences of complete loss of self, where the distinction between observer and observed dissolves, where one feels connected to everything and simultaneously to nothing. The brain, in these moments, seems incapable of maintaining the normal structures that generate our sense of individual identity, and researchers have noted that these experiences, while deeply strange and often ineffable, seem to offer genuine glimpses into what happens when the ego machinery simply stops functioning. According to one of the oldest and most philosophically sophisticated theories in human religious thought, what happens after death is neither oblivion nor continuation in the way we typically imagine it, but rather a fundamental dissolution of individual consciousness into an infinite, unchanging, eternal source of all reality known as Brahman. This concept emerges from the Upanishads, ancient Hindu philosophical texts written thousands of years ago, and forms the foundation of Advaita Vedanta, a school of non-dualistic philosophy that teaches that the apparent separation between the individual soul, or Atman, and Brahman is ultimately an illusion born from ignorance. The theory proposes that during life, we experience ourselves as distinct, separate entities moving through time and space, making choices, accumulating experiences and memories, but this entire sense of individual identity is merely a temporary veil obscuring a deeper truth. Upon death, according to this understanding, the illusion dissolves, and what we call the self realizes it was never truly separate from the infinite consciousness that permeates and constitutes all existence. The mechanism behind this belief rests on a logical framework suggesting that consciousness itself is the fundamental nature of reality rather than an emergent property of physical matter, and that individual minds are like waves that briefly rise from the ocean's surface, experiencing themselves as separate before inevitably returning to recognize they were always part of the whole. This theory persists across centuries despite lacking empirical evidence or measurable mechanisms, perhaps because it addresses some of humanity's deepest anxieties about death, non-existence, and meaninglessness by proposing that personal identity loss is actually liberation rather than annihilation, that we return to something infinite rather than nothing at all, transforming the prospect of death from termination into reunion with our true nature. In Hindu and Buddhist philosophical traditions spanning thousands of years, there exists a conception of death not as an endpoint or transition to another realm, but rather as a dissolution into absolute freedom, a state known as moksha or nirvana, wherein the individual self ceases to exist as a separate entity and merges entirely with the universal consciousness or Brahman. This theory proposes that what we experience as our individual identity, our memories, our desires, and our sense of being a distinct person moving through time, are all ultimately illusions created by Maya, a cosmic force of illusion that obscures our true nature. According to this framework, the goal of existence across multiple lifetimes of reincarnation is to gradually awaken to the reality that there has never been a separate self at all, only the one eternal consciousness experiencing itself through infinite temporary forms. When a person achieves sufficient spiritual wisdom and detachment from worldly desires and ego-driven impulses, death becomes the moment when this final illusion shatters, and the individual consciousness recognizes its identity with the infinite whole, experiencing a liberation so complete that there is no one left to experience anything at all, yet paradoxically described as ultimate bliss and peace. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory involves the human capacity to reframe suffering and impermanence as meaningful spiritual lessons, transforming the existential terror of non-existence into a desirable goal framed as enlightenment and union with the divine. What perpetuates this belief across cultures and centuries is its remarkable power to provide both comfort and purpose simultaneously, offering practitioners a comprehensive worldview that explains suffering as educational, death as liberating, and existence itself as a journey toward transcendence, while requiring no empirical verification whatsoever since the ultimate achievement lies entirely beyond communication or demonstration. Imagine a theory that takes the Buddhist concept of nirvana, that state of perfect peace and liberation from suffering that is supposed to represent the ultimate spiritual goal, and reframes it not as a transcendent achievement, but as complete and total annihilation of consciousness and existence itself. The nirvana extinction theory proposes that after death, the soul or consciousness does not merely shed its earthly attachments and ascend to some higher plane, but rather gradually dissolves like salt crystals melting into an infinite ocean, losing all individual identity and awareness until nothing whatsoever remains. This differs fundamentally from traditional Buddhist teachings by suggesting that nirvana is not enlightenment but erasure, a slow fade into absolute nothingness where there is no experience, no continuation of consciousness in any form, not even a peaceful void or spiritual continuation. The psychological mechanism supporting this theory likely stems from our human tendency to project our deepest fears onto religious and spiritual concepts we do not fully understand, transforming unfamiliar or abstract ideas into something more concrete and more frightening. When people encounter descriptions of nirvana in their studies of Buddhism, the language of ego death and the dissolution of self can resonate with existential anxieties about mortality and obliteration, leading them to interpret these philosophical concepts as literal descriptions of non-existence rather than spiritual transformation. What makes this theory particularly fascinating is how it persists within popular consciousness despite being at odds with actual Buddhist doctrine, which clearly articulates nirvana as a state of being rather than a state of non-being. We have somehow normalized this misinterpretation into our cultural understanding of death concepts, allowing it to occupy space in contemporary discussions about the afterlife even though it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the spiritual tradition from which it emerged. Consider the peculiar notion that consciousness, rather than beginning at birth or even at conception, instead exists in a state of perpetual potential before our arrival into the world, and that upon death, we do not pass into a new realm, but rather dissolve backward into that same unformed state from which we emerged, becoming unmade in the truest sense. This theory suggests that before we were born, we existed in a kind of quantum superposition, a space where infinite versions of ourselves could have been, and that death reverses this process entirely, erasing our individual thread from the tapestry of existence and returning us to that primordial nothing from which all possibility flows. The mechanism underlying this belief seems to rest on a temporal symmetry that appeals to our intuition. If consciousness had no beginning before conception, perhaps it has no ending after death, but rather a return to the state preceding our existence. The logic operates under the assumption that non-existence before birth and non-existence after death are not different conditions, but rather the same condition viewed from opposite directions, two ends of a single continuum that gives our lives their shape and meaning precisely because they are bounded by identical forms of nothingness. What makes this theory persist, despite its fundamental untestability and lack of empirical grounding, is perhaps how it offers a strange comfort to those who fear the prospect of eternal consciousness or judgment after death. The idea that we might simply become unmade, return to the gentle formlessness from which we came, stripped of memory and selfhood and concern, holds a peculiar appeal that transcends its logical coherence. We have somehow normalized the notion that symmetry in the universe extends to our own existence, that death mirrors birth with poetic precision, even though our experience of life gives us no actual evidence that such symmetry exists at all. Yet the theory persists in the imaginations of those seeking reassurance in the idea that the end might be as painless and unmarked as the beginning. Imagine the moment of death as not an ending, but rather a dissolution of the physical apparatus that has been filtering consciousness all along. A theory suggesting that our brains do not generate awareness, but instead act as receivers or transmitters of a more fundamental and universal consciousness that exists independently of matter itself. According to this perspective, when the brain ceases its biological functions, the individual consciousness does not vanish, but rather merges with or returns to this vast, infinite field of pure awareness that underlies all existence, experiencing what practitioners and theorists describe as a state of complete unity without subject or object, without the distinction between observer and observed, without the limitations imposed by sensory perception and the tyranny of the thinking mind. Those who contemplate this theory often draw parallels to meditative states that advanced practitioners claim to achieve while still living, moments of profound clarity where the sense of separate self dissolves and one becomes aware of consciousness itself rather than merely the contents of consciousness, suggesting that death might simply extend or make permanent this temporary glimpse that the living can occasionally taste during deep meditation or near-death experiences. The mechanism underlying this belief rests on a fundamental reinterpretation of quantum physics and neuroscience, proposing that consciousness is not generated by neural activity, but rather modulated by it, much like a radio receiver does not create the broadcast signal, but instead tunes into and receives it, allowing for the possibility that awareness continues to exist in some form even when the physical tuning mechanism has stopped functioning. This theory persists despite lacking measurable evidence or testable predictions, perhaps because it addresses a profound human hunger for continuity and meaning, offering the consolation that whatever we fundamentally are transcends the corruption and decay of flesh, and that the seemingly most important aspect of our existence cannot truly be destroyed by the mere failure of cellular processes. Consider the notion that consciousness does not end at death, but instead merges into a universal field of awareness that permeates all existence, a kind of cosmic mind that has always been present throughout the universe, operating at scales and dimensions beyond our ordinary perception, and that individual human consciousness is merely a temporary localized expression of this infinitely larger intelligence. According to this theory, when we die, our personal awareness does not dissolve into nothingness, but rather returns to this underlying universal consciousness like a wave retreating back into the ocean from which it briefly emerged, retaining all memories and experiences as part of the eternal cosmic record. The appeal of this concept draws heavily from both quantum physics misinterpretations and ancient philosophical traditions that describe reality as fundamentally mental or experiential in nature, suggesting that matter and energy are secondary manifestations of some primordial consciousness that gave rise to everything we perceive. Proponents argue that moments of profound intuition, synchronicity, or inexplicable connection between distant individuals point toward the existence of this unified field, and that death represents a transition rather than an ending, a return to the source from which we originated. The mechanism supporting this belief rests on the human tendency to seek patterns and meaning in randomness, to project consciousness onto natural phenomena, and to find comfort in the idea that something essential about us is eternal and indivisible from the universe itself. We have normalized this concept through popular literature, spiritual movements, and science fiction that present it as an intellectually sophisticated alternative to both traditional religion and scientific materialism, lending it a veneer of credibility that persists despite the absence of measurable evidence or falsifiable predictions. Imagine a moment where the boundaries between individual consciousness and cosmic consciousness dissolve entirely, where the distinct sense of self that has defined your existence for a lifetime suddenly merges back into an undifferentiated ocean of spiritual energy that pervades all of existence. This is the concept of universal soul return, a theory suggesting that upon death, the individual soul does not journey to a specific afterlife location or remain tethered to earthly planes, but rather reintegrates completely into a universal consciousness from which all souls originally emerged. According to this framework, every conscious being is essentially a temporary expression or localized manifestation of a singular, infinite spiritual essence that encompasses all things, all times, and all possibilities simultaneously. When death occurs, the individual consciousness recognizes this truth and dissolves the illusion of separation that allowed it to experience existence as a distinct entity. The mechanism underlying this theory operates on the principle that consciousness itself is not generated by biological processes, but rather channeled through them, much like how a television set receives and displays broadcast signals without actually generating the content itself. Death, in this view, simply disconnects the receiver from its temporary manifestation, allowing the broadcast itself, the soul, to return to its source. This theory persists across cultures and centuries despite lacking measurable evidence, likely because it offers profound comfort through the elimination of permanent extinction while simultaneously providing a sense of cosmic belonging and existential purpose. The appeal lies in its elegant resolution of loneliness, suggesting that separation is ultimately an illusion and that in returning to universal consciousness, one achieves reunion with all others who have died before and all others who will die after, transcending individual identity entirely into something simultaneously more vast and more intimate than personal survival. Perhaps the most philosophically unsettling theory about death, yet simultaneously the most logically straightforward, is the concept of final death oblivion, which posits that consciousness simply ceases to exist entirely upon the moment of biological death, that there is no afterlife, no continuation of awareness, no spiritual realm awaiting us, and no possibility of experience or perception beyond the final breath. This theory suggests that death represents an absolute and irreversible termination of all subjective experience, meaning that the vast complexity of thoughts, memories, emotions, and sense of self that we associate with being alive will vanish completely and permanently, leaving behind only a body without consciousness, without sensation, without any internal experience whatsoever. The logical foundation of this view rests upon our observable reality that consciousness appears to be directly correlated with brain activity, and that when brain function ceases permanently, all evidence suggests that consciousness ceases as well, a premise supported by our understanding of neuroscience and the apparent dependence of the mind upon the physical substrate of neural tissue. What makes final death oblivion particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is how this straightforward physicalist position contradicts our deepest evolutionary instincts and our fundamental human drive for self-preservation and continuity, because our brains have evolved over millions of years to prioritize survival and perpetuation, and the concept of absolute non-existence fundamentally opposes these core drives. We have built civilizations, religions, philosophies, and entire systems of meaning specifically designed to protect us from the psychological terror that this theory presents. And yet, despite all our elaborate cultural defenses against confronting true oblivion, the evidence supporting this view remains compelling and difficult to refute through any mechanism we can verify or measure. Consider the possibility that death does not represent an ending at all, but rather a collapse of temporal experience into a single, unchanging moment of infinite duration. According to this theory, consciousness at the moment of death becomes untethered from the forward march of time, and instead finds itself suspended in what physicists and philosophers have called the eternal now, a state where past, present, and future collapse into one singular, perpetual instant of being. In this framework, the dying person's final conscious moment expands infinitely, so that a single second of awareness stretches across what would have been eternity, containing within it every possible experience they could have had, every memory that shaped them, and every potential future they might have lived, all existing simultaneously in a kind of timeless consciousness that neither progresses nor regresses but simply is. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory draws from our deepest understanding of how consciousness relates to time itself, suggesting that perhaps time is not an objective feature of reality, but rather a construct of living brains, and that when the neural machinery generating temporal sequence finally ceases, the mind might perceive existence in an entirely different way, one without before or after, but only an eternal presence. What makes this theory persist despite its apparent rejection of causality in physics is its profound appeal to human intuition about subjective experience. The fact that in moments of extreme intensity or trauma, people report that time seems to dilate or compress, suggesting that the brain's timekeeping mechanisms are more fragile and contingent than we assume, and that perhaps in death's final instant, this already unstable temporal architecture could collapse entirely into something outside time altogether, a state of being that is neither alive nor dead, but permanently, unchangeably aware. Consider the peculiar notion that death might not be an ending at all, but rather a sudden and profound awakening from what we currently experience as life. In this theory, our present existence is understood as a kind of deep sleep or dream state, a realm of limited perception and constrained consciousness, and death represents the moment when we finally open our eyes to a far more authentic and expansive reality. Those who entertain this concept often describe our current waking life as surprisingly dreamlike when examined closely. We move through narratives that seem meaningful in the moment, yet possess a kind of illogical quality upon reflection. We accept impossible premises without question, and we experience time in ways that feel simultaneously eternal and instantaneous, much like the experience of dreams themselves. The theory suggests that whatever consciousness animates us might momentarily mistake its own dream for reality, becoming so absorbed in the narrative and sensory experience that it forgets the broader context of its actual existence. The psychological mechanism underlying this idea taps into a deeply human experience of occasionally awakening from vivid dreams, with the startling realization that what felt utterly real and consequential was merely a construction of the sleeping mind. This jarring contrast between dream conviction and waking recognition fuels the metaphorical power of the concept. If a sufficiently complex dream can feel this authentic while being fundamentally illusory, the theory reasons, why could not our entire existence function in precisely the same way? The familiarity of this experience makes the concept feel almost intuitively plausible, despite its fundamental unprovability. What persists despite its speculative nature is perhaps our lingering suspicion that reality operates on multiple levels, and that our current mode of perception might be capturing only a fraction of what actually exists around and within us. Consider the peculiar moment when you awaken from a particularly vivid dream, that suspended instant where the boundaries between sleeping and waking remain blurred, and you find yourself wondering whether the dream itself might have been aware of its own ending, conscious of the precise moment when it would dissolve into the morning light. This theory suggests that death, in its finality, might function as nothing more than an awakening from an elaborate dream, the ultimate and irreversible moment when consciousness recognizes itself as constructed, as a narrative that was always bound to conclude. In this framework, life is not so much a lived experience as it is a story being told to itself, complete with characters and conflicts and rising action, all of which must eventually reach their denouement. The mechanism underlying this concept rests upon the observation that dreams possess an internal logic while we inhabit them, that within the dream state we accept absurdities as natural and question nothing, but the moment we wake, we recognize the dream's inherent unreality with immediate clarity. Some philosophers have proposed that consciousness itself operates under similar conditions, that what we interpret as objective reality might be nothing more than an elaborate sensory narrative constructed by something we cannot perceive from within it. What makes this theory persistent despite its obvious untestability is its deep resonance with human experience, the way it transforms the terror of mortality into something almost poetic, almost comforting, suggesting that death might simply be the moment when the dreamer finally wakes. We have normalized this idea through literature and spirituality for centuries, weaving it into philosophical traditions and personal meditations, perhaps because it offers a strange solace, the possibility that our struggles and triumphs and losses might ultimately mean nothing because they never truly happened at all. Consider the profound observation known as the Fermi paradox, which asks a deceptively simple yet eternally troubling question. If the universe contains billions upon billions of galaxies, each harboring potentially billions of stars, and if even a fraction of those stars possess habitable planets where life might emerge and evolve into intelligent civilizations, then where is everybody, and why do we hear nothing but an overwhelming cosmic silence? This absence of detectable signals from extraterrestrial intelligence, despite the mathematical probability that such life should exist somewhere out there, has become known among some theorists as the Great Silence, and some have proposed an unsettling hypothesis about what this silence might mean for our own understanding of death and the afterlife. The theory suggests that advanced civilizations, upon reaching certain technological thresholds or spiritual enlightenment, discover truths about the nature of consciousness and existence that fundamentally transform their understanding of death itself. And perhaps these civilizations deliberately transmit no signals because they have transcended the need for material communication entirely. They may have discovered that consciousness itself is the universe attempting to understand itself, and that death is not an ending, but a transition into a state of pure awareness that exists outside the constraints of time and space. A state so profound and all-encompassing that attempts to communicate across the physical universe become as meaningless as trying to explain the ocean to a drop of water still suspended within it. The silence in this interpretation becomes not an absence but a presence, the presence of countless evolved minds that have moved beyond the limitations of our current understanding, existing in a realm where the boundary between life and death has been completely dissolved.